She dined with a man who ruled by fear, yet she arrived armed with nothing but etiquette, silence, and inherited power, and somehow the room bent anyway. Before the dictators, before the headlines, before the myth hardened into history, there was a Gilded Age heiress whose influence moved more smoothly than money ever could. In drawing rooms heavy with velvet and restraint, she learned that wealth did not need to announce itself, it only needed to be recognized. Her name opened doors that laws could not. Her presence softened men who believed themselves immovable. And when she crossed the Atlantic, she carried that same quiet authority into places where chandeliers were replaced by portraits of revolution. If you enjoy stories where history whispers instead of shouts, take a moment now to subscribe. Stay with me and let me know in the comments where you're listening from, because these stories were never meant to be rushed, and there is more power hidden in the shadows ahead. This is not a tale of glamour alone, nor of scandal for its own sake. It is the anatomy of influence in an age that pretended wealth was harmless and women were ornamental. This is the story of the Gilded Age heiress who dined with Stalin and quietly controlled American wealth long before anyone thought to question who was really holding the menu. She entered the world not with ceremony, but with certainty. The house was already waiting for her, the servants already instructed, the corridors already accustomed to quiet authority moving through them. There was no moment of arrival in the dramatic sense, no threshold crossed, no sudden ascent. Wealth, in this case, did not announce itself. It received her as if she had always been there. In families like hers, money was not discussed because it did not require explanation. It was assumed in the same way gravity was assumed, an invisible force that shaped posture, movement, expectation. Children learned early, not what things cost, but what they implied. Rooms taught lessons before tutors ever did. Ceilings rose high enough to train the neck upward, chairs were arranged to suggest hierarchy without instruction. Silence was rewarded. Excess emotion was corrected gently, then firmly, then never again. Her childhood unfolded within this careful architecture of restraint. There were no fairy tales about fortune gained or lost, no romantic myths of struggle. Wealth was presented as continuity, not achievement. It had been here before her, and it would remain long after. The task was not to expand it, nor to celebrate it, but to carry it without disturbing its balance. This was not framed as responsibility. It was framed as nature. Girls born into such houses were not raised to rebel, nor to compete openly. They were shaped to observe, to listen, to remember who spoke first, who hesitated, who deferred without realizing they had done so. They learned that power rarely declared itself. It arranged itself quietly and waited for others to step into its design. Men would later call this intuition. The household called it training. From an early age, she understood that decisiveness did not require volume. The loudest people in the room were often the least secure. The truly influential spoke sparingly, sometimes not at all, allowing others to fill the space and reveal themselves. This was not cynicism. It was fluency. A language learned long before adulthood, spoken without accent. The Gilded Age celebrated noise. New fortunes, new cities, new machines, new men announcing themselves with steel and smoke. But beneath the spectacle ran older currents. In certain families, money had learned to stay still. It did not chase opportunity. Opportunity came to it, rehearsed and deferential. These families did not fear change because they could absorb it. They did not fear governments because governments borrowed from them, directly or indirectly, politely or desperately. She grew up watching this process unfold as if it were weather. Bankers arrived and departed. Politicians passed through parlors with careful smiles. Conversations drifted from art to railroads to legislation without ever naming their true purpose. She noticed which guests returned and which did not. No explanations were offered. None were needed. By the time she reached adulthood, her authority was already practiced. She did not need to claim it. Others supplied it for her. Invitations bore her name with a tone that suggested inevitability. Decisions made in her presence carried a strange finality, even when she had said very little. This was not charisma. It was placement. She had been seated correctly long before she understood the room. There would be biographies later that described her as influential, formidable, mysterious. These words miss the point. Influence implies exertion. Mystery implies concealment. Her power required neither. It functioned openly, precisely because it appeared ordinary within its own environment. She was not remarkable for what she did, but for how naturally the world rearranged itself around her. This was the beginning, not of ambition, not of rebellion, not of scandal, but of inevitability. A woman formed inside wealth so complete it erased the need for display. A life that would later cross oceans, ideologies, and men who believed themselves unmovable. But here, at the start, there was only quiet certainty. She had been born already decisive into a world prepared to listen long before she ever spoke. The house did not merely shelter her, it instructed her. Its walls carried a curriculum older than any school, one learned through repetition rather than explanation. Every corridor enforced pace, every doorway dictated posture. Even the light behaved differently inside, softened by tall windows and heavy drapery, filtered so that nothing arrived harshly or without permission. Authority, she learned, was not a matter of command. It was a matter of environment. The house had been built to endure, not to impress. That distinction mattered. Its stone facade did not glitter. It settled. It suggested permanence rather than triumph, as if to announce that it had no interest in competing with the present moment. New money built upward, old money built inward. Here, ceilings were high not to inspire awe, but to remind occupants how small impatience could feel when given too much space. Servants moved quietly, not because they feared reprimand, but because the house itself discouraged noise. Footsteps softened on rugs thick enough to absorb urgency. Doors closed without sound. Bells summoned assistance without raising voices. The absence of haste became a discipline. One did not rush through these rooms any more than one rushed through a cathedral. From childhood, she absorbed the lesson that control did not need to be asserted if it was already assumed. The house functioned smoothly because expectations had been settled long ago. Everyone knew where they belonged, where they did not, and how to behave in the presence of thresholds. Even guests sensed it. Conversations slowed upon entering, voices lowered instinctively. Decisions once made here felt heavier, less reversible. Meals were formal not for ceremony's sake, but for calibration. Seating reinforced order. Distance between chairs was deliberate. Who sat nearest the host mattered, but so did who sat just far enough away to observe without participating. The house taught her that proximity was currency. One could grant or withhold it without explanation, and the effect would be felt immediately. There were portraits on the walls, but they were not heroic. Faces stared out with a familiarity that bordered on indifference. These were not ancestors celebrated for conquest or charisma. They were remembered for continuity, for not breaking the line, for understanding that survival at the top required patience more than brilliance. She learned early that decisions were rarely announced. They emerged quietly, disguised as consensus. A guest would not be invited again. A recommendation would not be made. A letter would go unanswered. No conflict arose, because conflict implied equals. The house dealt in asymmetry. This training extended beyond etiquette. It shaped her sense of time. Days were structured but never rushed. Seasons mattered. Long intervals passed without visible change, reinforcing the idea that movement was unnecessary when one already occupied the center. Others hurried because they needed to arrive somewhere. She was already there. Even play carried instruction. Games emphasized observation over competition. Winning loudly was discouraged. Winning discreetly was praised. Emotional displays were treated as minor embarrassments, corrected gently and then remembered. The house was not cruel, but it was precise. It taught that feelings were private and power was most effective when untouched by them. Outside, the world was transforming. Railroads cut through landscapes. Cities rose in smoke and steel. Fortunes appeared overnight and vanished just as quickly. But within these walls, change arrived, filtered, translated, slowed. News became discussion. Crisis became opportunity. Panic never crossed the threshold uninvited. By the time she was old enough to recognize the pattern, it had already settled into her. Authority felt natural because it had never been withheld. She did not crave it because it had never been scarce. The house had done its work well. It had taught her how to be listened to without demanding attention, how to decide without appearing decisive, how to exist as a fixed point while others orbited anxiously around her. This was not arrogance, it was conditioning. And when she eventually stepped beyond these walls, into drawing rooms, into boardrooms, into foreign cities where power wore different costumes, the lessons traveled with her. The house had prepared her for rooms far larger than itself. It had taught her that wherever space was carefully arranged, authority could be learned, assumed, and quietly exercised. She carried the house with her long after she no longer lived inside it. Money, in her world, was never presented as an object. It was not counted aloud, nor displayed with pride, nor feared for its absence. It existed instead as atmosphere, an invisible presence that altered behavior without ever introducing itself. Like air pressure, it was only noticed when it shifted. She grew up surrounded by this quiet abundance, yet rarely witnessed a transaction. Bills were settled elsewhere. Accounts moved behind closed doors. What she encountered instead were effects. Rooms were warm in winter without discussion. Travel occurred without preparation. Crises arrived softened, pre-managed, already diminished by the time they reached the household. Money did not solve problems publicly. It prevented them privately. This taught her an early and enduring lesson. True wealth does not interrupt life. It removes interruptions from life. Others spoke of money as ambition or reward. In her experience, it functioned as insulation. It separated urgency from decision, desire, from consequence. It created a buffer so complete that reactions could be delayed, refined, perfected. The ability to wait, to respond slowly while others rushed, became one of its greatest privileges. In drawing rooms and parlors, she watched guests adjust unconsciously. Some arrived rehearsed, eager, performing success too carefully. Others arrived tentative, aware of the imbalance but uncertain how to address it. A few arrived relaxed, already fluent in the same air. These distinctions mattered more than titles or resumes. Money, when omnipresent, trained perception. She learned to read this immediately, the way a man sat before being invited to sit, the speed with which someone filled silence, the subtle discomfort of those who tried to impress rather than belong. Wealth made people reveal themselves without being asked. It shortened conversations by clarifying them. The Gilded Age pretended that money was loud, displayed in mansions, jewels, galas, headlines. But those displays belonged to a specific stratum, the newly arrived. Old money, like old cities, avoided spectacle. It preferred equilibrium. Its power lay in stability, not expansion. It did not chase returns. It positioned itself where returns were inevitable. In this environment, generosity took on a particular shape. Donations were made without ceremony. Philanthropy functioned as adjustment, not charity. Funds were allocated the way furniture was rearranged, to maintain balance, to preserve flow. Gratitude was neither expected nor particularly welcome. Acknowledgement implied disruption. She absorbed this instinctively. When she later gave, she did so without sentiment. When she withheld, she did so without explanation. Both actions felt identical internally. Money, after all, was not emotional. It was structural. What unsettled outsiders most was how little attention she seemed to pay to wealth itself. She did not speak of it, because it did not interest her. It was simply the medium in which her world existed, like water to a swimmer who had never stood on dry land. Those who obsessed over it appeared unsophisticated, fixated on surface while missing function. As she matured, this detachment became her greatest advantage. Men negotiated with her expecting desire, fear, ambition. They encountered instead calm assessment. She did not need outcomes urgently. Time favored her by default. In every discussion, she could afford to pause. And in those pauses, others often conceded ground without realizing they had done so. Money as atmosphere also blurred moral urgency. Nothing felt immediately at stake. Consequences arrived distantly, if at all. This did not make her cruel, but it did make her precise. Sympathy existed, but it did not guide decisions. Stability did. By the time she stepped fully into society, her relationship to wealth was complete and invisible. She neither defended it nor apologized for it. She moved through rooms unencumbered by the noise surrounding, money elsewhere. And because she treated it as background rather than subject, others followed suit, until they realized too late that everything in the room had already been shaped by its presence. Money, in her hands, was not a tool. It was the climate. In her world, girls were not raised to express themselves. They were raised to function. This was never stated outright. No one announced it as doctrine. No manual was issued. No cruelty advertised. The lesson arrived quietly, embedded in routine, reinforced by praise and omission alike. Boys were encouraged to assert, to experiment, to test boundaries, and recover from the inevitable noise of failure. Girls, by contrast, were shaped for calibration. Their value lay not in action, but in adjustment. She learned this early, though she would not have named it at the time. The adults around her spoke often of refinement, composure, grace. These words appeared gentle, even complimentary, but beneath them lay expectation. Refinement meant self-erasure at the appropriate moment. Composure meant emotional containment regardless of circumstance. Grace meant making accommodation appear effortless. Girls were taught to become responsive surfaces, sensitive enough to detect imbalance, resilient, enough to absorb it without visible strain. Education reinforced this design. Languages were emphasized not for communication, but for diplomacy. Music was encouraged not for passion, but for discipline. Art was permitted so long as it remained tasteful, restrained, non-confrontational. Intellect was admired in moderation, provided it did not seek dominance. Curiosity was acceptable, so long as it did not wander into challenge. What mattered most was usefulness. She observed that girls who adapted well were praised as mature, promising, admirable. Those who resisted were gently corrected, then quietly marginalized. No punishment was required. Social gravity did the work. Approval flowed predictably toward those who learned to anticipate needs without being asked. The most effective girls became instruments, finely tuned, responsive, indispensable. They learned to stabilize rooms by their presence alone. They softened edges, redirected conversations, soothed egos bruised by invisible hierarchies. They remembered names, preferences, grievances. They made complicated arrangements feel inevitable and unforced. She noticed, too, that these instruments were never credited with authorship. Outcomes simply occurred around them. Decisions emerged seemingly from consensus. Men congratulated themselves on clarity, unaware of how carefully the atmosphere had been prepared. This was not exploitation in the crude sense. It was cultivation. Her household did not speak of marriage as romance. It was discussed as alignment. Suitability mattered more than affection. Compatibility meant shared expectations about silence, discretion, and continuity. Love, if it appeared, was expected to adapt. Girls were prepared accordingly. They learned how to listen without revealing their own conclusions, how to encourage confidence without surrendering position, how to suggest without appearing to influence. These were not tricks. They were survival skills in a system that rewarded subtlety and punished disruption. She internalized these lessons deeply, not because she feared consequence, but because they worked. She saw how easily rooms could be steered by someone willing to remain unseen. She learned that the most efficient path to control was through facilitation rather than confrontation. Yet something else developed alongside this training: detachment. Being raised as an instrument required emotional distance. One could not absorb endlessly without dulling sensation. Empathy existed, but it was moderated, rationed. Feelings were acknowledged privately, then set aside. Function came first. By the time she entered society in earnest, she had mastered this balance. She could be present without being exposed, engaged without being entangled. She understood how to become essential without becoming visible. Observers would later describe her as composed, inscrutable, commanding in a quiet way. They would miss the mechanism beneath the impression. She was not commanding. She was calibrated, perfectly adjusted to a world that rewarded girls who learned how to disappear into influence. This training would follow her far beyond drawing rooms and marriages. It would serve her in boardrooms, in negotiations, in unfamiliar countries where power wore harsher expressions. While others mistook authority for force, she understood its subtler form. She had been raised not to rule openly, but to make ruling appear unnecessary. And in that distinction lay her enduring power. Silence in her upbringing was not absence. It was articulation. She learned this not through instruction, but through observation. Words, when used carelessly, revealed too much. Silence, when placed correctly, revealed everything else. In rooms where wealth had settled for generations, conversation was never meant to carry meaning on its own. Meaning traveled in pauses, in glances that lingered a fraction too long, in the decision not to correct an error aloud. The uninitiated mistook this quiet for politeness. They spoke eagerly, filling gaps with anecdotes, assurances, ambitions. They believed silence invited participation. They did not understand that silence here was already speaking. From childhood, she noticed how often the most consequential moments passed without dialogue. A proposal left unanswered, a suggestion acknowledged only with a nod, a remark allowed to hang, unchallenged, until its speaker reconsidered it themselves. No confrontation followed, none was needed. Silence did the work more cleanly. This restraint was not passive, it required constant attention. One had to listen fully, not merely for content, but for motive. What was being requested without being stated? What insecurity was being disguised as confidence? What urgency betrayed weakness? Silence allowed these things to surface unimpeded. She learned that those who feared silence feared exposure. They rushed to fill it because stillness forced self-awareness. In the quiet, people confronted their own standing in the room. They sensed hierarchy instinctively, the way one senses temperature change before naming it. Women, especially, were expected to master this fluency. Loudness was forgiven in men as vigor, ambition, even brilliance. In women, it was treated as miscalculation. Silence, by contrast, was praised as elegance. But beneath the compliment lay strategy. A silent woman could be present everywhere without leaving fingerprints. She practiced this deliberately. Gatherings. She spoke less than others, but listened more intently. When she did speak, it was measured, never impulsive, never explanatory. She avoided conclusions, preferred observations. This invited others to complete the thought for her, often in ways that revealed their own priorities. Over time, something curious happened. People began to speak to her differently. They justified themselves. They clarified without prompting. They waited for her response longer than was necessary. Silence, properly maintained, rearranged power without declaration. She saw how this unsettled those accustomed to command. Men who dominated conversations grew uneasy when she did not engage on their terms. They mistook her quiet for acquiescence, then discovered too late that decisions had already moved beyond them. Others mistook it for ignorance, only to realize she had retained everything. The Gilded Age celebrated spectacle, yet its deepest negotiations occurred in understated rooms conducted by those who understood restraint. Silence functioned as a gate. Only those comfortable within it belonged. Others disqualified themselves unknowingly. This fluency extended into correspondence. Letters were brief, responses delayed just enough to reassert control. Timing mattered as much as wording. To reply too quickly was to concede urgency. To reply too slowly was to signal dismissal. She learned the precise intervals that communicated engagement without submission. Silence also protected her. It kept her unreadable. In a society eager to categorize women, ornament, accomplice, obstacle, opacity became armor. By offering little, she denied others the material needed to reduce her. Yet silence was not emptiness. Internally, she was alert, analytic, constantly assembling impressions into structure. The quiet allowed clarity. It sharpened rather than dulled perception. While others performed certainty, she observed consequence. As her world expanded, this skill became invaluable. In foreign settings where customs shifted and power presented itself differently, silence traveled well. It required no translation. It disarmed aggression and exposed impatience. It allowed her to occupy space without challenging it openly. Long before she ever entered rooms where ideology replaced etiquette, she had already mastered the language that crossed all hierarchies. Silence was not what she withheld. It was what she wielded. Inheritance, in families like hers, did not arrive as a question. It was not offered, nor negotiated, nor framed as opportunity. It descended, quietly, inevitably, like weather that had been forecast generations in advance. By the time it reached her, refusal was no longer a concept. The decision had already been made by the living and the dead alike. She first sensed its weight long before it became legally hers. It lingered in conversations that stopped when she entered the room, in documents folded away before she could read them. In the careful way, elders spoke of continuity, stewardship, and responsibility, words that sounded virtuous but carried no alternative. Inheritance was not possession. It was assignment. Unlike earned wealth, inherited wealth demanded obedience. It arrived bound to expectation, history, and obligation. It did not ask what she wanted. It asked only whether she would maintain what already existed. The fortune was not hers to reshape freely. It was hers. To preserve, to position, to ensure it did not fracture under misuse or sentiment. When the transfer finally occurred, it was anticlimactic. No ceremony marked the moment, no transformation followed. The world did not change its posture toward her because it had already adjusted long before the ink dried. Lawyers spoke softly. Papers moved across polished surfaces. Names were affirmed, signatures added, seals applied. And just like that, an abstract inevitability became formal reality. What unsettled her was not the scale of it, but its impersonality. The wealth did not acknowledge her character, her aptitude, or her consent. It treated her as a continuation, not an individual. She understood then that inheritance was not reward, it was constraint. It narrowed the range of acceptable action even as it expanded capacity. Choices that might have been available to others were quietly removed from her path. Risk became irresponsible, excess became vulgar, independence became suspect. Those around her congratulated her in careful tones, as though aware that celebration would be inappropriate. Envy remained unspoken, replaced by assumption. She was expected to handle it competently, invisibly, without disturbance. Gratitude was unnecessary. The inheritance was not generous. It was correct. She realized quickly that wealth of this nature resisted emotion. To love it would be indulgent. To resent it would be futile. The only workable posture was neutrality. Stewardship required detachment. Decisions had to be made without sentiment, guided by precedent rather than impulse. The fortune was older than her preferences and would outlast them. This understanding hardened her, not in cruelty, but in clarity. She recognized that personal desires were irrelevant when set against systems this entrenched. What mattered was alignment. She learned to ask not what she wanted to do, but what the structure required next. Where stability needed reinforcement, where influence could be exercised quietly to prevent disruption. The inheritance came with an unspoken warning. Visibility was dangerous. Those who flaunted inherited power invited scrutiny, resentment, and eventual correction. Those who moved discreetly endured. The fortune had survived because its custodians had treated it as infrastructure, not identity. She followed this example instinctively. She allowed others to underestimate her involvement. She appeared ceremonial when necessary, absent when possible. She delegated loudly and decided privately. The machinery of wealth continued to operate without calling attention to its operator. In this way, the inheritance shaped her relationship to power itself. She did not crave recognition because recognition threatened stability. She did not seek control overtly because overt control attracted resistance. Instead, she learned to influence indirectly, to shape outcomes while remaining peripheral to their execution. By accepting the inheritance without protest, she accepted its terms. She surrendered the illusion of choice in exchange for something far more enduring: position. She became part of a system that functioned above individuals, above politics, above the turbulence of the moment. It was not a gift. It was not a burden. It was a structure that could not be refused, and once accepted, could never be escaped. Her name preceded her in ways she did not control and never needed to correct. It moved ahead quietly, announced not by volume, but by recognition. Doors opened before she reached them, conversations adjusted in advance. Hosts prepared not for her arrival, but for the consequences of it. Names like hers did not function as identifiers, they functioned as assurances. She learned this gradually, noticing how often introductions were unnecessary. People knew who she was before she spoke. They knew where she belonged, where she could sit, what she would be allowed to say without challenge. Her name carried accumulated certainty, the residue of decades, sometimes centuries, of consistency. It signaled that nothing reckless would occur in her presence, that continuity would be respected. For outsiders, the effect was subtle but unmistakable. Invitations arrived phrased with deference, masked as courtesy. Requests were made carefully, wrapped in language that allowed retreat without embarrassment. Disagreements softened when she entered the room, not because she demanded peace, but because her presence suggested that disorder would not be indulged. She understood early that her name did not guarantee affection. It guaranteed access. That distinction mattered. Affection could be withdrawn. Access, once normalized, was harder to deny. She was allowed into rooms where decisions had already begun to take shape, not to dominate them, but to legitimize them. Her attendance implied endorsement, or at least tolerance. In elite circles, tolerance was often enough. Men with louder reputations mistook this for admiration. They spoke freely in her presence, believing they were impressing her. They did not realize they were being evaluated. Her name had not opened the room for her benefit alone. It had opened the room to scrutiny. She noticed how often people adjusted their posture when she was mentioned, even in her absence. How correspondence shifted tone, how hesitation entered conversations previously confident. The name operated independently, like a credential that required no renewal. It did not expire with age or circumstance. It was not attached to achievement. It existed because it had always existed. The Gilded Age produced many prominent names: industrialists, financiers, men whose wealth announced itself with scale and noise. Their names surged and faded with markets, scandals, and public favor. Hers did not fluctuate. It remained constant because it was not tied to novelty. It belonged to infrastructure rather than spectacle. She observed that those who benefited most from her name rarely acknowledged it openly. Gratitude would have implied dependence. Instead, they behaved as though access were natural, deserved, mutual. This fiction suited everyone involved. It allowed power to circulate without acknowledgement, influence to be exchanged without accounting. Over time, she learned to wield her name sparingly. Overuse diluted its effect. She declined invitations that did not require her presence. She accepted those where her absence would be noticed. This selectivity reinforced the illusion that her participation was incidental, when in fact, it was strategic. The name also protected her. In moments of uncertainty, it discouraged intrusion. Journalists hesitated, critics softened. Challenges dissolved into private complaints rather than public confrontation. The name did not make her untouchable, but it raised the cost of engagement. Yet there was confinement in this as well. Her name fixed expectations. It limited reinvention. It tethered her to a role that could be expanded but never abandoned. She could move across borders, ideologies, even social systems, but always as herself, always carrying the same assumptions forward. She accepted this with practiced composure. The name was not her identity, but it was her instrument. It allowed her to move through spaces that would have resisted others. It granted her credibility where no argument would suffice. It gave her time, attention, and silence when those were the most valuable currencies in the room. Long before she ever sat at tables where power wore harsher faces, her name had already done the work. It had opened rooms that did not yet know why they were opening, and once opened, those rooms rarely closed again. She was not taught to command a room. She was taught where to sit. The distinction was subtle, but decisive. In households governed by permanence rather than performance, the center was never claimed. It was assigned. Chairs were placed before voices were raised. Distances were calibrated long before opinions were expressed. Authority began not with speech, but with placement. She learned this lesson early, observing how gatherings arranged themselves instinctively around certain figures. The center was rarely dramatic. It did not shout for attention. It simply existed as a point of reference, a position from which others measured themselves. Those seated there did not lean forward. They did not fill silence. They allowed the room to orient itself toward them. At first, she was positioned slightly off-center, close enough to observe, but distant enough to remain untested. This was intentional. Proximity was earned through reliability. She watched how others navigated that space, who tried too quickly to claim it, who avoided it entirely, who lingered at its edges hoping to be drawn in. The center was not comfortable. It required discipline. One could not fidget, could not dominate, could not retreat. To occupy it successfully, one had to absorb attention without reacting to it. She practiced this patiently. She learned how to appear engaged without being invested, decisive without being rigid. She noticed that those who sought the center openly rarely held it long. Their urgency betrayed insecurity. The center belonged to those who treated it as incidental, as if it were simply the most practical place to sit. This posture disarmed resistance. It made authority feel accidental rather than imposed. As she grew older, hosts began placing her there without consultation. It happened quietly, often without acknowledgement. A chair closer to the hearth, a position near the head of the table, but not quite at it. Enough proximity to matter, enough distance to remain neutral. This ambiguity was powerful. It allowed her to influence without being held accountable for outcomes. From the center, she could see everything. She could read the room's temperature before conflict surfaced. She could anticipate shifts in allegiance, detect when confidence was rehearsed rather than genuine. She learned when to speak, rarely, and when to allow others to expose themselves through excess. The center also taught restraint. It demanded economy of motion and speech. Any indulgence was amplified. Any misstep was noticed. To remain there required consistency. She understood that authority, once normalized, was fragile if mishandled. She became adept at managing attention. She neither invited it nor rejected it. She allowed it to settle, to hover, to dissipate naturally. This unnerved those accustomed to controlling rooms through volume or spectacle. They mistook her calm for passivity until they realized decisions had already aligned themselves around her. Presence. In time, she recognized that the center was not a fixed point. It could travel. It could be recreated wherever she sat, provided the environment allowed for it. She carried the posture with her, the stillness, the patience, the refusal to rush conclusions. These traits created a gravity that reassembled rooms regardless of geography. This understanding would serve her well later, in spaces where the customs were unfamiliar and the stakes more explicit. But the lesson began here, in drawing rooms and dining halls where nothing appeared urgent, and everything was. Learning to sit at the center did not make her powerful overnight. It made her inevitable. By the time others noticed where she was seated, the room had already adjusted. Conversations flowed around her. Decisions gravitated toward her. She did not need to move. The center had learned her shape and held it. New York, by the time she came fully into it, was no longer a city discovering itself. It was a city rehearsing. Steel climbed upward with confidence that bordered on impatience. Streets filled with motion that suggested progress even when none was occurring. Wealth announced itself loudly through height, speed, novelty, each display attempting to outshine the last. The city had learned that being seen mattered as much as being powerful, and often more. She observed this transformation without urgency. To her, New York felt less like a place and more like a stage being constructed in real time. Every facade performed. Every dinner glittered slightly too much. Every man with money seemed compelled to prove that he deserved it. The city's energy was restless, performative, constantly in motion because stillness threatened to reveal uncertainty. Old Wealth watched this with polite distance. She learned quickly that New York rewarded spectacle, but relied on something quieter to function. For every visible empire rising in public, there existed a lattice of invisible permissions beneath it. Financing, zoning, introductions, credibility. These things were rarely obtained through noise. They were acquired through access. Society provided the filter. Drawing rooms replaced offices as places where futures were tested. Guest lists became instruments of regulation. Who was invited, who was seated where, who was spoken to twice instead of once. These details shaped outcomes more reliably than contracts. The city's elite pretended these gatherings were social. They were not. They were rehearsals for power. She moved through this world with ease, not because she dazzled, but because she did not need to. New York respected confidence that did not seek applause. In a city addicted to novelty, familiarity carried its own authority. Her presence suggested continuity in a place terrified of becoming obsolete. She noticed how men performed ambition differently here. They spoke in figures, in projections, in future tense. They emphasized scale, speed, expansion. They talked about conquering markets the way earlier generations had spoken of land. Yet, beneath the bravado lay anxiety, about legitimacy, about permanence, about whether the city would remember them once the noise faded. She did not share this anxiety. Her standing did not depend on growth. It depended on placement. New York adjusted to her accordingly. She was invited not because she needed to be impressed, but because others needed to be seen by her. Attendance became a form of endorsement. Her approval was never stated, but its absence was noticed. This suited her perfectly. It allowed her to remain neutral while still exerting influence. The city, for all its energy, required restraint to survive. Too much speculation destabilized markets. Too much ambition invited collapse. The role of society was to temper excess without appearing to do so. It rewarded those who learned to perform, within acceptable bounds, and sidelined those who did not. She understood this instinctively. Her demeanor offered a counterweight to New York's success. Where others accelerated, she slowed. Where others embellished, she simplified. This contrast made her presence grounding. People left rooms calmer than when they entered, convinced something stabilizing had occurred, even if they could not name it. New York learned over time to perform for her, not theatrically, but carefully. It learned which displays were welcome and which were vulgar. It learned when to impress and when to defer. The city's elite absorbed these cues eagerly, grateful for structure amid the chaos of rapid ascent. She never announced herself as an arbiter. She did not need to. New York, anxious to be taken seriously by history, gravitated toward those who embodied continuity. In her, it found a living reminder that power did not have to rush. And so the city rehearsed itself endlessly, its wealth, its ambition, its modernity, while quietly relying on figures like her to ensure that beneath the performance, nothing truly unraveled. The dinners appeared indulgent only to those who did not understand their purpose. Linen was immaculate, courses carefully timed, wine selected with an air of casual inevitability. Conversation drifted easily, never settling too long on a single subject. To an outsider, it looked like leisure elevated to ritual. To those who belonged, it was labor. Food was incidental. These dinners existed not to nourish the body, but to test alignment. Every invitation carried intent. Every place setting communicated rank. Who arrived early, who arrived late, who apologized and who did not. These details mattered more than any spoken exchange. Appetite was irrelevant. Observation was everything. She learned early that the table functioned as a sorting mechanism. People revealed themselves quickly when seated. Some spoke too much, eager to justify their presence. Others performed restraint so carefully it bordered on fear. A few navigated the evening with practiced ease, neither dominating nor withdrawing, already fluent in the unspoken rules. These were noted. Courses arrived and departed as conversation shifted deliberately. Certain topics were introduced not to be discussed, but to observe reaction. A mention of regulation. A passing reference to labor unrest. A name dropped without explanation. The goal was never consensus. It was exposure. She rarely spoke during these moments. She did not need to. Silence allowed others to move freely, to overextend, to retreat clumsily. What they revealed in their responses mattered more than what they said. Position could be inferred from tone alone. The host's role was not hospitality. It was calibration. Comfort was provided just enough to encourage authenticity. Discomfort was introduced subtly, never acknowledged. Chairs placed slightly too close together. Questions posed with misleading neutrality. Laughter that arrived half a beat late. These were not accidents, they were instruments. She mastered this environment quickly. Her upbringing had prepared her well. She understood that the success of a dinner was measured not by enjoyment, but by clarity. By the end of the evening, the room should understand itself better than it had upon arrival. Alliances clarified, aspirations exposed, limitations revealed. She also learned that these dinners produced no records, no minutes were taken, no agreements signed. Outcomes appeared later, detached from their origin. A deal stalled inexplicably. A recommendation traveled through channels no one could trace. A rival found doors quietly closed. The dinner was never mentioned again. This deniability was essential. It allowed power to move without accountability. It preserved the fiction that decisions were made elsewhere, by formal mechanisms, rather than over roast and wine in rooms heavy with implication. For women like her, the dinner table was one of the few sanctioned arenas of influence. It was socially acceptable, even expected, that she attend. Her presence was decorative, ostensibly. That assumption protected her. Men spoke freely around her, underestimating the extent to which she listened. She did not correct this misunderstanding. Over time, her attendance became significant. Invitations shifted in tone. Hosts began to consider her availability before finalizing guest lists. She noticed dinners rearranged to accommodate her schedule. This was never stated. It simply occurred. The table adjusted. She never appeared hungry. She ate lightly, deliberately, leaving plates unfinished. This was not affectation. It signaled disinterest in indulgence, a focus elsewhere. Others followed unconsciously, moderating themselves in response. Excess looked out of place in her presence. These dinners were not about pleasure. They were about positioning. They determined who would be taken seriously, who would be indulged temporarily, who would be tolerated, and who would quietly disappear from future invitations. By the time plates were cleared, the real work was done. And when the evening ended, guests departed with the vague sense that something important had occurred, though they could not say precisely what. That uncertainty was intentional. It ensured dependence. People returned again and again, hoping for clarity that would never be granted directly. She understood then that power, when exercised well, never announces itself as power. It disguises itself as custom. And at these dinners, where nothing important was ever said aloud, she learned just how much could be decided between courses. They did not think of it as permission. That was the elegance of the arrangement. To name it would have been to acknowledge dependence, and dependence sat poorly with men accustomed to command. Instead, they called it courtesy, or timing, or prudence. They told themselves they were waiting for the right moment. They did not realize they were waiting for her. She watched this pattern repeat itself with quiet fascination. Men who governed banks, railroads, trusts, men whose signatures could move markets, entered rooms confident, decisive, prepared. Yet once inside her orbit, something shifted. Their certainty softened, their pace slowed. They began to explain themselves. At first, she assumed this was coincidence. Later, she understood it as calibration. These men had grown powerful in a world that rewarded aggression, scale, and visibility. They were used to overcoming resistance through force of will or capital. But her world operated differently. It valued continuity over conquest, discretion over expansion. In that environment, their usual instruments felt blunt. They sensed this instinctively. A banker would pause before committing to a course of action, glancing toward her as if seeking confirmation he did not intend to request. An industrialist would outline a plan in detail, then wait, just long enough to see if she objected. A politician would frame policy as inevitability, then soften it into suggestion, watching for her reaction. She rarely gave them what they wanted. Instead, she offered neutrality. A nod without endorsement, a silence that neither approved nor condemned. This unsettled them more than opposition ever could. Opposition could be argued with, outmaneuvered, overcome. Silence required interpretation, and interpretation invited doubt. They filled that doubt themselves. Some became cautious, delaying decisions that had once seemed urgent. Others adjusted proposals preemptively, convinced they had miscalculated something unseen. A few reacted, defensively, mistaking her restraint for judgment. Those men rarely returned. What united them all was the gradual realization that progress required alignment, not with law, not with markets, but with her world's unspoken expectations. They did not need her consent explicitly. They needed to avoid her disapproval. And, since disapproval was never stated, they learned to anticipate it. This was the true function of her influence. She did not command outcomes, she shaped the conditions under which outcomes felt permissible. Men still believed they acted independently. That belief was essential. Power exercised openly invites resistance. Power exercised invisibly becomes environment. She observed how this affected them privately. Confidence remained intact publicly, but in her presence it acquired caution. They spoke of legacy more than ambition, of stability more than profit. They framed decisions as necessary rather than desired. This rhetorical shift mattered. It signaled adaptation. She never corrected them when they overestimated her interest. She never reassured them when they underestimated her reach. Both miscalculations served her equally well. In time, her role became understood without being articulated. She was not an obstacle nor a champion. She was a filter. Men whose plans passed through her orbit emerged refined, restrained, legitimized. Those whose plans did not often faltered elsewhere, blamed on circumstances no one could quite define. The most perceptive among them adjusted quickly. They learned to consult indirectly, through intermediaries, through social signals, through timing rather than request. They learned which causes she attended, which she ignored, which she left early. They treated her schedule as weather, something to be respected, never challenged. She did not enjoy this dependence, she accepted it. It confirmed what her upbringing had already taught her, that authority did not require dominance, and that the most powerful permissions were the ones never spoken aloud. By the time these men realized they were waiting for something, the waiting itself had become habit. And habit, she knew, was stronger than consent. She did not block access, she regulated it. That distinction mattered. Gates, after all, are not walls. They are mechanisms, designed to open and close, to admit and exclude without appearing hostile. A wall invites resistance. A gate invites patience. Those who understand this do not batter against it. They wait. She became such a gate without ever announcing herself as one. People did not come to her seeking approval directly. That would have been gauche, even humiliating. Instead, they moved around her carefully, gauging proximity, searching for alignment. They asked questions whose answers were irrelevant, merely to observe how she responded. They attended events she attended, avoided causes she avoided, adjusted their language subtly when her name entered conversation. Access, she understood, was the most valuable currency of her world, not money. Money could be acquired, borrowed, flaunted. Access could not. It had to be granted, and once granted, it could just as easily be withdrawn without explanation. She never announced exclusion. She simply allowed invitations to lapse. She declined to introduce. She failed to remember names she had once known perfectly well. The effect was immediate and lasting. Those inside the gate moved with confidence, certain of their legitimacy. Those outside felt it instinctively. They did not need to be told they no longer belonged. The absence of reinforcement was enough. Social gravity did the rest. She noticed how quickly people adapted their behavior once they sensed the boundary. They softened rhetoric. They tempered ambition. They emphasized responsibility, heritage, stability. Some learned, others resisted, mistaking exclusion for misunderstanding rather than judgment. Those individuals rarely returned to relevance. What made her role effective was its invisibility. No list existed, no criteria were published. Admission depended not on achievement alone, but on comportment, on whether someone could move within power. Without disturbing it, loud success was tolerated briefly. Sustained access required restraint. This was not cruelty. It was maintenance. The system she protected depended on equilibrium. Too much volatility threatened everyone inside it, including herself. The gate ensured that those allowed through understood the cost of imbalance. She rarely spoke of this openly, even to herself. The language of morality did not apply neatly here. She did not judge worth. She judged fit. The difference was subtle but decisive. Fit could change. Worth was irrelevant. Over time, her presence reshaped the ecosystem around her. People self-selected. Those unable to tolerate ambiguity drifted away. Those who thrived within it gravitated closer. The gate refined without confrontation. She also understood when to open it. New money, when disciplined, was sometimes admitted. New ideas, when properly packaged, could pass through. Innovation was not forbidden, it was filtered. The gate was not meant to preserve stasis, but to prevent rupture. Her greatest skill lay in timing. She sensed when inclusion would stabilize a situation rather than disrupt it. She sensed when exclusion would allow disorder to exhaust itself without intervention. These decisions were rarely conscious. They emerged from years of observation, from patterns absorbed so deeply they felt instinctive. Others attributed this to intuition. They were not wrong. But intuition, in her case, was trained. By positioning herself as a gate rather than a judge, she avoided resentment. People blamed circumstance, not her. They told themselves they had arrived too early or too late or under the wrong conditions. They did not accuse her of refusal because she had never explicitly refused anything. This preserved her authority. As her world expanded, beyond New York, beyond familiar circles, the gate traveled with her. Different rooms, different customs, same principle. Access was always the question, even when it was never spoken aloud. She had learned that power did not need to deny. It only needed to delay. And in that delay, outcomes arranged themselves. Charity, in her world, was never an act of generosity. It was an adjustment. She learned this early, long before she ever signed her name to a foundation or posed for a photograph beside a ceremonial donation. Philanthropy did not emerge from impulse or compassion alone. It emerged from necessity, the need to stabilize a system that produced excess as reliably as it produced inequality. Giving was not meant to correct imbalance, it was meant to soften its edges. Publicly, philanthropy appeared benevolent. It arrived dressed in gratitude and ceremony, accompanied by speeches that praised conscience and civic duty. Privately, it functioned as camouflage. It diverted attention. It absorbed criticism. It allowed wealth to remain structurally untouched while appearing responsive. She understood this without cynicism. It was not hypocrisy. It was mechanics. Money concentrated inevitably. That concentration produced pressure, social, political, moral. Philanthropy released that pressure in controlled increments. Hospitals were endowed, museums expanded, universities flourished. These institutions became visible proof that wealth served something larger than itself, even as the underlying structures that generated inequality remained unchanged. She did not romanticize this process. She respected its efficiency. Her donations were deliberate, strategic, rarely emotional. Causes were chosen not for urgency, but for placement. Cultural institutions stabilized prestige. Educational institutions shaped future administrators. Health initiatives deflected scrutiny without inviting regulation. Each gift served multiple purposes simultaneously, and none of them were accidental. She noticed how quickly philanthropy altered perception. The same fortune that might have been resented as excessive became admired once it attached itself to improvement. Criticism softened, language shifted. Wealth was no longer hoarded, it was stewarded. The difference lay not in behavior, but in framing. She also observed how philanthropy disciplined recipients. Institutions that relied on patronage learned discretion. They avoided controversy. They adapted priorities subtly to align with donor expectations. Independence survived in theory, but caution guided practice. This was not coercion, it was alignment. No instructions were necessary. She rarely intervened directly. That would have been inelegant. Influence worked best when it appeared coincidental. A suggestion made in passing. A concern raised gently. An interest expressed once, then never repeated. The institution adjusted accordingly, grateful for continued support. Philanthropy also provided cover for influence that might otherwise attract scrutiny. Meetings framed as charitable gatherings facilitated private discussion. Travel justified by humanitarian purpose opened diplomatic doors. Conversations that would have appeared improper in financial contexts became acceptable when conducted under the banner of goodwill. She understood this duality intuitively. Charity allowed her to move through spaces that would have resisted her presence otherwise. It softened suspicion. It created moral insulation. Critics existed, of course. They spoke of performative generosity, of benevolence masking control. She did not argue with them. argument would have legitimized their position. Instead, she continued quietly, allowing results, however partial, to speak. What mattered most was that philanthropy preserved discretion. It redirected public curiosity toward visible good while keeping invisible mechanisms intact. It allowed wealth to appear humane without becoming accountable. She was careful never to overuse it. Excessive charity invited examination. Too much generosity raised questions about motive. The most effective philanthropy was moderate, consistent, unremarkable. It blended into expectation. She also recognized its limitations. Philanthropy could not solve systemic problems without threatening the system that enabled it. That contradiction was accepted, even embraced. Charity was not meant to end inequality. It was meant to manage it. This clarity did not trouble her. She had never believed the system could be reformed through sentiment alone. Stability required compromise, and philanthropy was one such compromise, visible enough to reassure, restrained enough to preserve structure. In time, her reputation as a benefactor became another layer of protection. It discouraged intrusion. It framed her influence as altruistic rather than strategic. It allowed her to operate with moral credibility even as she shaped outcomes far removed from charitable intent. Philanthropy, she knew, was not the opposite of power. It was one of its most effective disguises. From the outside, the architecture of power appeared unmistakably masculine. Men occupied the podiums, signed the documents, delivered the speeches. Their names filled headlines. Their portraits lined offices. They spoke with confidence about markets conquered, industries mastered, futures secured through force of will and calculation. History, as it was recorded publicly, belonged to them. She never contested this narrative. It was too useful. The illusion of male control functioned as a stabilizing myth. It allowed men to believe they governed outcomes entirely through intellect and ambition, insulated from influences they neither saw nor acknowledged. This belief kept them predictable. It encouraged risk-taking in directions already anticipated. It distracted them from subtler currents shaping their decisions long before they reached the point of action. She observed how carefully this illusion was maintained. Men were allowed to feel decisive, even heroic, so long as their decisiveness operated within established boundaries. When they exceeded those bounds, resistance appeared, not as confrontation, but as friction. Financing became complicated, introductions stalled, support softened, no opposition was declared. The illusion remained intact. The correction was attributed to circumstance. This arrangement suited everyone involved. Men retained their sense of authorship. The system retained equilibrium. She remained invisible. In private settings, the contrast was more apparent. Men who dominated public forums became tentative in quieter rooms. They deferred subtly, sought affirmation without admitting they sought it. They spoke of pressure, of uncertainty, of the weight of expectation. They did not see these confessions as surrender. They saw them as candor. She received them without judgment. She understood that control, when absolute, rarely announces itself. Those who truly govern do not require acknowledgement. The visible actors, executives, politicians, industrialists, functioned as interfaces. They translated decisions shaped elsewhere into public action. Their authority was real, but conditional. She never diminished their contribution. That would have been counterproductive. Instead, she allowed them to inhabit the role fully. Their confidence sustained the system's outward coherence. Their competition distracted from the underlying continuity. Women like her existed in the interstices of this structure. They were not absent from power. They were embedded within it. Their influence was exercised through calibration rather than command, through permission rather than instruction, through silence rather than decree. She noticed how rarely men questioned this arrangement. To do so would have required acknowledging dependence, a notion incompatible with their self-image. They preferred to believe that success flowed upward from effort alone. When obstacles appeared, they attributed them to rivals, markets, misfortune, never to social boundaries they could not see. This blindness was not accidental. It was cultivated. The system rewarded those who accepted its myths without interrogation. Those who questioned too deeply found themselves isolated, labeled difficult or unreliable. She watched this occur repeatedly. Men who sensed the limits of their autonomy but spoke of them openly were quietly sidelined. Others learned to adapt even if they never fully understood how. She did not resent this dynamic. Resentment implied desire for recognition. She had none. Recognition would have destabilized the illusion, and with it, the system she navigated so effectively. The illusion of male control also protected her. It shielded her from scrutiny. It ensured that blame, when necessary, traveled upward toward visible figures. She remained insulated, her influence diffused across networks rather than concentrated in her name alone. In moments of candor, some men sensed the truth. They spoke of invisible forces, of old families, of social currents that resisted disruption. They gestured vaguely toward her world without naming it. She listened without confirmation. Acknowledgement would have burdened them with knowledge they could not use. The brilliance of the illusion lay in its durability. It survived even as evidence contradicted it. Men continued to believe they ruled, because ruling felt real within the parameters allowed to them. And for most purposes, that reality was sufficient. She understood that power did not require honesty to function. It required coherence. And as long as men believed they controlled the machine, they would never look closely at who maintained it. There were ledgers in her world that never touched paper. They existed instead in memory, in tone, in the quiet accumulation of impression. Every interaction was recorded, not verbatim, but in essence, who arrived prepared, who overreached, who listened, who forgot themselves. These entries were never erased. They faded only when replaced by newer, stronger impressions. She learned to keep such ledgers instinctively. Unlike financial accounts, social ledgers did not balance neatly. A single misstep could outweigh years of competence. A moment of restraint could redeem a reputation otherwise fragile. Apologies were rarely entered as credit. Consistency mattered more than contrition. Reliability mattered more than charm. She observed how few people understood this economy. Many believed that influence could be accumulated through visibility, attendance, speech, presence. They filled rooms, spoke often, offered opinions freely. They assumed activity equaled value. In truth, the ledger recorded something else entirely: judgment. Who knew when to withdraw? Who recognized when a conversation was not meant for them? Who accepted correction without resentment? These qualities accrued silently, compounding over time. Her upbringing had prepared her well for this arithmetic. She understood that trust was not earned through enthusiasm, but through predictability. Those who behaved consistently could be relied upon to behave consistently again. This reliability was invaluable. It allowed systems to function without constant oversight. She maintained her ledgers without cruelty. They were not instruments of punishment. They were tools of navigation. Knowing where someone stood allowed her to place them appropriately, closer or farther, earlier or later, inside or outside. This placement often determined outcomes more decisively than ability ever could. She noticed how often people attempted to reset their standing through grand gestures, donations, public alignment, performative loyalty. These acts registered briefly, then dissolved. The ledger weighed them against history and found them insufficient. True credit accumulated slowly. It required restraint under pressure, discretion in moments of advantage, silence when speech would have been easier. Few possessed the patience for this. Those who did often underestimated their own standing, unaware of how much they were trusted. The ledger also tracked absence. Who did not attend, and why? Declining an invitation could signal confidence or disrespect, depending on context. She paid attention to these nuances. The wrong absence could suggest avoidance. The right absence could suggest authority. Nothing was neutral. She rarely referenced her ledgers consciously. Decisions emerged naturally, informed by years of quiet accounting. When she recommended someone, it was not because they impressed her recently, but because their balance over time had remained stable. When she withheld support, it was often due to a pattern others had missed entirely. This invisibility protected her judgments from challenge. No one could argue against a record they could not see. They sensed it only through outcomes, doors opening or closing without explanation. She also understood the danger of error. Misjudging someone could ripple outward, destabilizing arrangements carefully maintained. For this reason, she was cautious. She preferred to observe too long rather than decide too quickly. Delay preserved optionality. Others mistook this for indecision. It was not. The ledger did not exist to predict brilliance. It existed to predict behavior. Brilliance could be accommodated. Unpredictability could not. As her influence expanded beyond familiar circles, these ledgers traveled with her. New environments required recalibration, but the principles remained constant. People revealed themselves in similar ways, regardless of culture or context. Pressure compressed character into readable form. She trusted this process implicitly. In time, she realized that these social ledgers constituted a parallel economy, one that governed access, credibility, and survival just as surely as money governed markets. Most people never saw it. Those who did rarely spoke of it. She kept her records quietly, accurately, and without sentiment, and because of that, her world rarely surprised her. The table was never arranged casually. Its length, its shape, the distance between place settings, these were not aesthetic choices. They were cartography. She learned to read it the way others read contracts. At every dinner, luncheon, or private gathering, the table presented a geography of power more accurate than any organizational chart. The head mattered, but so did proximity to it. Corners suggested caution, centers implied scrutiny. Adjacent seats signaled favor, but also exposure. Distance was never neutral. She observed how quickly people intuited this without admitting they had done so. Guests measured their placement instinctively, adjusting posture and tone accordingly. Some leaned forward, eager to bridge distance. Others leaned back, relieved to have been spared attention. A few pretended not to notice at all, the most revealing response of all. The table, she understood, was a diagram of current relevance. Those closest to the center were tested, their remarks weighed, their reactions noted. Those farther away were allowed indulgence, their errors excused. This was not kindness, it was hierarchy. Influence required discipline. Peripheral figures were permitted freedom because they mattered less. She herself was rarely placed at the obvious head. That position invited confrontation. Instead, she occupied seats that allowed sightlines to both ends, to entrances, to subtle exchanges occurring beyond the primary conversation. From there, she could observe without being forced to perform. This placement was intentional. Hosts understood her preferences, even if they could not articulate them. The table adjusted around her the way rooms adjusted to load-bearing structures. She learned that changing a single seat could alter the entire dynamic of an evening. Placing two rivals adjacent forced premature politeness, separating allies tested loyalty. Positioning an ambitious newcomer beside a veteran revealed whether they listened or spoke first. These arrangements extracted information more efficiently than any direct inquiry. Food arrived and departed, but the real movement was spatial. Plates shifted, chairs angled subtly, glasses refilled or left empty. These micro-adjustments communicated inclusion or neglect. Guests sensed these signals even if they pretended not to. Bodies responded before minds caught up. She mastered this language thoroughly. When she hosted, she planned seating days in advance. Not rigidly, flexibility was essential, but with intention. She anticipated friction points and pressure points alike. The table became a controlled environment in which behavior could be observed under mild stress. Outcomes emerged naturally. People left dinners feeling affirmed or unsettled without knowing why. Alliances weakened or strengthened quietly. Future invitations clarified themselves. As her gatherings grew more diverse, politicians beside financiers, academics beside industrialists, the table became even more valuable. It allowed disparate worlds to meet under controlled conditions. Differences surfaced without erupting. Compatibility could be assessed without commitment. She noticed how often men overestimated their position based on proximity alone. Sitting near power did not grant it. It merely exposed one to evaluation. Some wilted under that pressure, others rose to it. The table made this visible quickly. Over time, her reputation as a host deepened. People trusted her arrangements, even when they made them uncomfortable. They sensed that the discomfort served a purpose. This trust extended her influence further than any overt authority ever could. The table also functioned as rehearsal. Decisions that would later be made formally were previewed informally, reactions tested, resistance measured. By the time matters reached official channels, outcomes felt foregone. She rarely corrected misunderstandings aloud. If someone misread their position, the table would clarify it eventually. Repetition reinforced lesson. Those who learned adapted. Those who did not faded. As she moved beyond New York, into unfamiliar settings and cultures, she carried this instinct with her. Tables changed, simpler, grander, more austere, but the principles remained. Proximity signaled trust. Distance preserved control. She understood then that power did not merely occupy space, it organized it. And at every table she entered, she read the map first, before deciding how or whether to move. Money, once it reached a certain scale, ceased to recognize borders. She understood this long before it became fashionable to say so. While nations argued over tariffs and treaties, capital moved quietly, indifferent to rhetoric. It sought stability, predictability, and return, not loyalty. Flags mattered to crowds. Capital preferred neutrality. She watched this dynamic unfold with growing clarity as her world expanded beyond New York. Conversations shifted subtly when Europe entered the room. Not Europe as romance or heritage, but Europe as ledger. Banks older than republics, families older than states, obligations that survived revolutions by adapting rather than resisting. Capital, she learned, did not fear upheaval. It feared disorder without structure. Wars ended, regimes fell, borders shifted, but money, properly positioned, endured. It migrated discreetly, reclassified itself, reappeared under new arrangements. What mattered was not ideology, but access to continuity. Those who understood this prospered quietly. Those who tied wealth too closely to national identity often lost everything. She never spoke of patriotism in financial terms. That would have been naive. Loyalty to a nation was emotional. Capital required detachment. She understood that governments borrowed legitimacy from money far more often than money borrowed legitimacy from governments. This detachment unsettled some. They preferred to imagine wealth as national strength, capital as civic virtue. She allowed them this comfort. It did not interfere with outcomes. Her own investments reflected this fluency. They were distributed, diversified, layered. No single jurisdiction held leverage over the whole. This was not evasion. It was prudence. History had taught her that permanence belonged to those who avoided singular dependence. As global tension intensified, this approach became more valuable. Nations postured, economies lurched, new ideologies promised purity and renewal. Capital listened politely and continued elsewhere. She observed how quickly governments softened their rhetoric when confronted with its absence. Access mattered more than allegiance. She also noticed how often ideology served as performance rather than conviction. Leaders spoke passionately in public, then privately reassured financiers. The language shifted. Certainty dissolved into negotiation. Capital was welcomed even by those who publicly condemned it, provided it arrived discreetly. She did not judge this hypocrisy. She understood it as necessity. In private rooms, stripped of ceremony, discussions became practical. What would be allowed? What would be taxed? What would be overlooked? Capital was not offended by contradiction. It required only clarity. Her role in these exchanges was rarely explicit. She did not negotiate terms. She signaled presence. That was enough. Her involvement suggested seriousness, continuity, and restraint. It reassured participants that decisions would not be impulsive. She learned that capital functioned best when it appeared boring. Stability attracted more than brilliance. Predictability outperformed innovation over time. This was the secret the loudest men never grasped. As her travels increased, she encountered different attitudes toward wealth, but the same underlying dependence. Even the most ideological regimes required capital to function. Infrastructure demanded investment, industry required credit, authority required legitimacy, and legitimacy was easier to sustain when resources flowed. She watched governments learn this lesson reluctantly. Capital without flags was not rootless, it was adaptable. It spoke many languages, respected local customs, adopted the appearance required to survive. It did not belong anywhere because it could operate everywhere. She had been raised to understand this intuitively. Her inheritance had taught her that wealth survived by avoiding emotional attachment. That lesson now scaled globally. In a world increasingly divided by ideology, she remained uncommitted, not apathetic, strategic. She understood that aligning too closely with any single vision risked collapse when that vision failed. So she positioned herself and her capital above rhetoric and beneath notice. Money did not need to wave a flag, it only needed to pass through the room unchallenged. Europe did not feel foreign to her, it felt rehearsed. Long before she ever crossed the Atlantic with intent, Europe had existed in her imagination not as destination, but as reference. Its manners, its hierarchies, its silences had already been imported into her upbringing, filtered through old families who spoke of Paris and Vienna the way others spoke of seasons. Europe was not exotic. It was ancestral memory refined into habit. When she arrived, she did so without anticipation. Surprise would have been improper. The cities received her with a recognition that bypassed formality. Titles mattered here, but they mattered differently. They were less about authority than about placement, signals of where one stood in a web far older than any single government. She moved easily within this structure, recognizing its rhythms immediately. The pauses before introductions, the way conversations curved rather than concluded, the importance of lineage spoken indirectly through anecdote, rather than declaration. Europe's elites had survived too much to be impressed by novelty. Revolutions had burned through their capitals. Empires had collapsed and reassembled under new names. Money had changed hands, been confiscated, been restored, been renamed. Those who remained had learned discretion as a survival strategy. She respected this instinctively. In salons and private dining rooms, she observed how power here preferred understatement. Grandeur existed, but it was softened by age. Confidence was expressed through familiarity rather than assertion. One did not dominate conversation. One allowed it to unfold around them. She noticed how similar this felt to her own world, despite superficial differences. The same rules applied. Silence mattered. Restraint signaled legitimacy. Overexposure invited correction. Europe also taught her patience. Where America rushed forward, Europe waited. Decisions moved slowly, weighed against precedent rather than possibility. This slowness was not inefficiency. It was insulation. It prevented rash change, absorbed shocks, preserved continuity. She admired this deeply. She also understood its cost. Europe's stability often concealed stagnation. Old hierarchies resisted adaptation. Innovation was tolerated only when it did not threaten structure. But even this resistance was familiar. Her own world balanced similarly, adapting just enough to survive, never enough to transform itself entirely. In these settings, she was neither outsider nor novelty. She was recognized as someone who understood the rules without being instructed. This granted her access to conversations others never heard, not because she demanded it, but because she did not disrupt it. Men spoke candidly in her presence, not recklessly, never that, but with an ease reserved for those who did not need convincing. They discussed instability in measured tones. They spoke of governments as temporary arrangements. They treated ideology as weather, something to be navigated rather than believed. She listened more than she spoke. Europe rewarded this. It trusted those who observed before acting. Her silence marked her as serious. She became aware gradually that Europe functioned as a rehearsal space for global power. Ideas were tested here quietly before being exported. Alliances formed informally, then hardened into policy later. Capital flowed through familiar corridors, adapting to local custom while preserving its intent. She fit seamlessly into this environment, her presence reassured. She represented continuity across oceans, a reminder that power did not originate in one place alone. Her name carried weight here, not because of nationality, but because of alignment. She belonged to a class that recognized itself across borders. Europe did not require her loyalty, it required her discretion. As she moved from city to city, she realized that this stage, old, patient, deeply practiced, would shape her future. Interactions profoundly. It taught her that power endured not by insisting on relevance, but by making itself indispensable quietly. Europe was not a past she visited. It was a system she already understood. And in its familiar silence, she learned how far influence could travel without ever raising its voice. She never held a title that authorized negotiation. No seal validated her presence. No mandate accompanied her across borders. And yet, in rooms where official envoys strained beneath protocol, she was listened to with a different kind of seriousness, one that did not require documentation. This was diplomacy without office. She understood early that official power carried constraints. It required alignment with policy, obedience to hierarchy, adherence to language that obscured intention beneath ceremony. Informal power, by contrast, moved freely. It spoke plainly when needed, ambiguously when useful. It answered to no electorate, no ministry, no timetable. Her value lay precisely there. When she entered a room, she did not represent a government, she represented continuity. Her presence suggested that whatever was being discussed mattered beyond the present administration, beyond the current crisis, beyond ideology. This alone changed the tone. People adjusted their expectations upward. They spoke more carefully. They avoided promises they could not keep. She was not there to extract concessions. She was there to observe alignment. Governments, she learned, revealed their true intentions most clearly when they believed they were speaking off the record. In private conversations framed as exploratory or hypothetical, positions emerged with greater clarity than in any formal communiqué. She listened to these disclosures with care, understanding that discretion was the currency that made them possible. Her responses were measured. She did not react emotionally. She did not challenge directly. She offered perspective rather than position, a reminder of precedent, a reference to stability, a quiet acknowledgement of constraint. These gestures reassured without committing. Those who spoke with her often left believing they had been understood, even when no agreement had been reached. This sense of being heard mattered. It softened resistance. It delayed confrontation. It allowed space for recalibration. She noticed how often official diplomats resented this influence. They worked within rigid frameworks, bound by instructions that could not adapt quickly enough. They envied her flexibility, her ability to move between conversations without consequence. Yet they also relied on her presence. It allowed them to test ideas indirectly, to gauge reactions without exposure. She never embarrassed them by acknowledging this dynamic. Her discretion made her useful. She became, over time, a conduit, not for messages but for tone. She carried impressions from one room to another, subtly influencing expectations. She never misrepresented what she heard, but she translated it. Urgency became caution, certainty became possibility, hostility became fatigue. This translation required discipline. She resisted the temptation to intervene too much. Over-involvement invited scrutiny. Her power depended on remaining optional, helpful but not essential. This allowed her to withdraw when necessary, preserving credibility. Diplomacy without office also required restraint of ambition. She did not seek outcomes she could claim publicly. She accepted influence without recognition. This protected her from blame when negotiations failed and from obligation when they succeeded. She observed how easily governments mistook visibility for legitimacy. They announced agreements loudly, believing declaration itself conferred authority. She knew better. Authority came from endurance, from whether arrangements survived change. Her interest lay there. As tensions grew globally, her role became more pronounced. Official channels hardened, rhetoric intensified. In this climate, informal dialogue became not merely useful, but essential. She provided a space where uncertainty could be acknowledged without penalty. She also learned the limits of this role. Informal power could not override force indefinitely. It could not prevent rupture when interests diverged too sharply. But it could delay, soften, redirect. It could create openings where none appeared to exist. She accepted these limits without frustration. Diplomacy, she knew, was not about control. It was about navigation. By remaining outside formal structures, she preserved her freedom to move. She spoke with those others could not. She entered rooms without altering their balance simply by being there. This invisibility was her greatest asset. She did not need an office to negotiate. The absence of one was precisely what allowed her to do so. Revolutions, when viewed from proximity, were chaos. When viewed from distance, they were patterns. She learned this not from theory, but from repetition. Each upheaval arrived with the same language: liberation, renewal, inevitability. Each promised rupture with the past. Each insisted it could not fail. And yet, from far enough away, their contours became familiar. The slogans changed. The faces changed. The underlying mechanics did not. She did not fear revolutions. Fear required attachment. From her vantage, revolutions were moments of acceleration, violent compressions of forces long in motion. They did not create instability so much as reveal it. Old systems collapsed not because they were attacked, but because they had already hollowed themselves out. What followed was rarely clarity. It was negotiation, conducted under the pretense of certainty. She watched these events with disciplined detachment. Newspapers dramatized them. Crowds mythologized them. Governments panicked publicly, then recalculated privately. Capital, meanwhile, repositioned quietly, already preparing for whatever structure would emerge next. She understood that revolutions were loud precisely because they lacked infrastructure. Noise compensated for uncertainty. The louder the declaration, the more fragile the foundation beneath it. From her distance, geographical, emotional, strategic, she observed how quickly revolutionary fervor required management. Committees formed. Hierarchies reappeared under new names. Control consolidated around those least interested in spectacle and most interested in continuity. The cycle completed itself with grim efficiency. She did not intervene. Intervention implied belief. She preferred observation. Her distance was not indifference. It was calibration. She tracked who survived transitions, not who dominated the first weeks. She noted which figures adapted language without surrendering position, which institutions were dismantled entirely, and which were quietly repurposed. She paid particular attention to how new regimes treated money. Ideology might condemn capital publicly, but necessity courted it privately. Factories required investment, infrastructure required maintenance, armies required supply. Even the most uncompromising rhetoric softened when confronted with logistics. She watched leaders learn this lesson with visible discomfort. Her distance allowed patience. She did not rush to interpret events as success or failure. She waited to see what endured after the banners were lowered and the streets cleared. Endurance, she knew, was the only meaningful measure of power. Those who sought her opinion during such moments often found her unhelpfully restrained. She did not offer predictions. She did not endorse movements. She spoke instead of timelines, of consolidation, of fatigue. This disappointed those craving affirmation. It reassured those who understood. She recognized that revolutions demanded participants. They required belief, sacrifice, fervor. Distance denied them that fuel. From afar, they lost their romance and revealed their administrative reality. Her role, if it could be called that, was to remain unentangled. She preserved optionality. When systems fell, she was not counted among their defenders. When new systems rose, she was not burdened with their promises. This neutrality preserved her relevance across transitions. She also understood that distance was a privilege. Many could not afford it. Their lives were bound to outcomes beyond their control. She did not romanticize her position, she simply accepted it. Revolutions burned brightly, then settled into structures remarkably similar to what they replaced. The names changed, the uniforms changed, the hierarchy endured. From where she stood, history did not move forward in triumphal arcs. It circled, loudly, violently, and then quietly, back toward order. And she watched, always from just far enough away to see the pattern. Before it named itself, disorder announced itself loudly. Order did not need to. She had seen enough upheaval to recognize the difference immediately. Chaos demanded attention, through spectacle, through urgency, through fear. Order, by contrast, drew power quietly, almost politely. It promised predictability where none had existed, relief where exhaustion had set in. and after revolution, exhaustion always followed. She understood why order appealed most strongly to those who had lived through uncertainty. Ideals burned quickly, administration endured. In the aftermath of upheaval, rhetoric softened. Certainty gave way to fatigue. The very people who had once spoken of permanent transformation began to speak instead of schedules, supply chains, quotas, security. The language shifted from vision to maintenance. This transition was not betrayal. It was necessity. She watched this transition with particular interest. Order did not announce itself as virtue. It presented itself as solution. It spoke in terms of efficiency, stability, restoration. It promised to end the strain of constant vigilance, to replace uncertainty with routine, to allow people to sleep. This was its power. She recognized that order, even when harsh, often felt merciful after chaos. It relieved the burden of choice. It simplified complexity. It reduced life to manageable expectations. For populations exhausted by upheaval, this simplicity felt like safety. She did not confuse this with justice. Order and justice rarely arrive together. But order arrived first, because without it, nothing else could function. Governments understood this. So did those who advised them privately. She listened carefully when conversations turned toward structure, when emphasis shifted from ideals to enforcement, when leaders spoke less about what should be and more about what could be controlled. These were signals. They marked the moment when power hardened. Her distance allowed her to observe without illusion. She did not recoil from the appeal of order. She acknowledged it. Stability had always been the quiet preference of her world. Volatility threatened systems that depended on continuity. She also understood the danger. Order, once established, resisted reform. It justified itself through endurance. Those who benefited from it defended it passionately. Those constrained by it were expected to endure quietly. Over time, order became indistinguishable from authority. Yet, she did not moralize this process. Moralizing obscured understanding. She saw how often appeals to order attracted unexpected allies, industrialists wary of disruption, bureaucrats eager for clarity, even former revolutionaries tired of improvisation found comfort in rules. Order unified those who feared unpredictability more than injustice. She noted, too, how order relied on cooperation from elites. Control required infrastructure. Infrastructure required capital. Ideology might condemn wealth, but order required its participation. This contradiction was managed discreetly. Public denunciation coexisted with private accommodation. She did not need to endorse this alignment to benefit from it. Her world had always favored order, even when it pretended otherwise. Predictability protected assets. Stability preserved influence. Chaos threatened both. When leaders spoke to her about restoring control, they often framed it as regretful necessity. She accepted this framing without comment. Whether regret was genuine mattered less than outcome. Order, once established, rarely apologized for itself. She recognized that the appeal of order lay not in its morality, but in its relief. It promised an end to decision fatigue, an end to uncertainty, an end to waiting. This promise was powerful. It explained why populations accepted restrictions they would have rejected earlier, why compliance increased even as ideals narrowed, why endurance replaced enthusiasm. She did not celebrate this. She did not resist it. She understood it. In her experience, systems survived not by inspiring loyalty, but by reducing friction. Order achieved this efficiently. It made itself indispensable by making alternatives feel unbearable. From her vantage, order was not inherently good or evil. It was simply what followed exhaustion, and those who understood this, who anticipated the turn toward structure, were always positioned to endure whatever came next. Ideology, she learned, was most dangerous when mistaken for permanence. She had watched beliefs rise with conviction and collapse under administration. Each movement declared itself inevitable. Each insisted history had chosen a side, and each, in time, encountered the same constraints: logistics, labor, finance, fatigue. Ideology promised clarity, reality demanded compromise. She did not dismiss ideology, she simply refused to belong to it. This refusal was not cynicism, it was discipline. Allegiance narrowed vision. It required loyalty to outcomes before those outcomes had revealed themselves. She preferred position to belief, observation to commitment. This allowed her to move where others could not. Crossing ideological boundaries required restraint. One had to listen without affirming, to acknowledge without endorsing. She mastered this early. In conversations charged with certainty, she responded with patience. She allowed others to articulate their convictions fully, knowing that conviction often weakened once spoken aloud and left unsupported by action. Her neutrality unsettled some. They mistook it for evasion. Others sensed its value immediately. Those who governed understood that ideologies were tools, useful, mobilizing, temporary. They recognized in her a fellow pragmatist. Even if she never named it as such, she crossed borders that hardened ideologues could not. She entered rooms where beliefs collided, not to reconcile them, but to understand their limits. She noticed how quickly certainty softened when confronted with complexity, how slogans fractured under detail, how doctrine bent when exposed to consequence. She never corrected these fractures. Correction implied engagement. She allowed contradictions to reveal themselves naturally. This approach protected her from collapse when ideologies failed. Those who tied their identity to belief suffered disorientation when reality intervened. She did not. Her identity rested elsewhere. In continuity, in structure, in the slow rhythms that survived ideological turnover. She also understood that ideology often served as camouflage for ambition. Leaders cloaked self-interest in moral language, believing this elevated their cause. She listened without illusion. Ambition revealed itself eventually, regardless of vocabulary. Her lack of allegiance made her useful to all sides and indispensable to none. This balance mattered. Dependence invited scrutiny. Utility preserved access. In moments of transition, when regimes shifted, when alliances fractured, she remained steady. She did not scramble to reposition publicly. Her distance allowed her to wait while others declared prematurely. When clarity arrived, she adjusted quietly. This patience was mistaken by some as passivity. It was not. It was preservation. She recognized that crossing ideology without allegiance required careful self-containment. One could not reveal preferences. One could not react impulsively. Emotion betrayed alignment. She kept hers guarded, not out of coldness, but out of necessity. Over time, this neutrality became reputation. She was known as someone who listened, who understood, who did not demand loyalty in exchange for access. This attracted those weary of performance. It repelled those who required affirmation. Both outcomes served her equally well. She never claimed objectivity. She knew none existed. But she practiced detachment. This allowed her to see patterns others missed. How ideologies cycled, how power adapted, how order reasserted itself regardless of rhetoric. By crossing ideological lines without belonging to any, she preserved her freedom of movement. She was not constrained by promises she had never made. She was not burdened by betrayals she had never committed. In a world increasingly divided by belief, her refusal to choose sides appeared anomalous, even suspicious. But history favored those who understood that ideologies passed through time like weather. And she had learned, long ago, how to travel without getting wet. The invitation did not arrive dramatically. There was no flourish, no urgency, no insistence that history was about to be made. It came instead with restraint, measured language, careful phrasing, a tone that suggested inevitability rather than excitement. That alone told her it was serious. Power, when confident, does not rush. She recognized immediately what such an invitation implied. It was not social. It was not ceremonial. It was exploratory. An interest expressed without commitment, extended quietly to someone believed capable of listening without reacting. The East did not invite spectacle. It invited assessment. She took time before responding. Delay, in this context, was not hesitation. It was calibration. Accepting too quickly would suggest eagerness. Declining outright would suggest judgment. The correct response required balance, acknowledgement without acceleration. When she did reply, her words were brief, neutral, and deliberately unremarkable. The machinery behind. The invitation continued smoothly. She understood what lay beneath it. The East, in its new configuration, was consolidating. It sought recognition without concession, access without submission. It was wary of diplomats and suspicious of ideologues. What it required were intermediaries, figures who did not arrive carrying policy, but context. She fit this requirement precisely. Her background reassured, her detachment signaled safety. She was not there to advocate, condemn, or convert. She was there to observe, to understand, to report impressions without transforming them into declarations. This made her valuable. The logistics unfolded quietly. Travel arranged without publicity. Accommodations practical, not indulgent. Every detail communicated seriousness. There would be no performance, no indulgence, no attempt to charm. She did not romanticize the moment. She had seen enough transitions to recognize the pattern. New power always sought legitimacy, not validation, but acknowledgement. Being seen mattered, even when applause was unnecessary. She prepared accordingly, not by studying ideology, but by studying context. She revisited histories of collapse and consolidation. She reviewed patterns of control, of order reasserted after chaos. She did not seek to predict outcomes. She sought to recognize intent. As the date approached, she noticed subtle shifts in her surroundings. Conversations adjusted. Questions were asked indirectly. Others sensed movement without knowing its direction. Her world reacted instinctively, registering the invitation as signal rather than event. Some cautioned her quietly. Others expressed curiosity disguised as concern. She accepted both without comment. Caution and curiosity were equally irrelevant. What mattered was presence. She understood that this invitation marked a threshold, not because it promised alliance, but because it acknowledged relevance. The East did not reach out casually. It reached out to those it believed could see beyond rhetoric, beyond fear, beyond novelty. She accepted because refusal would have been interpreted as judgment, and judgment closed doors prematurely. Her departure was understated. No announcements, no explanations. She moved as she always had, quietly, deliberately, without commentary. Those who noticed understood enough to remain silent. Those who did not were not meant to. As she prepared to cross into unfamiliar territory, she did not feel anticipation. Anticipation belonged to those who expected outcomes. She expected only information. The invitation from the East was not an honor. It was not a threat. It was a question. And she had been trained her entire life to answer such questions without speaking too much. By all conventional measures, the journey should have been inconsequential. No treaty accompanied it, no delegation followed, no statement announced its purpose. It was framed as observation, as curiosity, as a visit without agenda. In the language of power, it was deliberately small. And yet, it unsettled precisely because of that restraint. She understood this paradox immediately. Journeys that mattered loudly were easy to categorize. They arrived with flags and headlines, with expectations carefully shaped in advance. This one arrived quietly, stripped of performance. It resisted interpretation. That made it dangerous. From the moment she departed, the absence of spectacle became its defining feature. There were no send-offs, no reassurances offered to onlookers. Her movement was noted only by those trained to notice such things. In her world, silence around motion signaled intent. The route itself was unremarkable. Rail, then ship, then rail again. Nothing extraordinary. But she observed how logistics tightened as she moved eastward. Protocol sharpened, hospitality thinned, efficiency replaced ceremony. Every transition was managed without warmth or hostility, as if emotion itself had been deemed unnecessary. She appreciated this clarity. The environments she passed through reflected consolidation rather than confidence. Buildings were functional. Security was present but understated. There was no excess to admire and no deprivation to pity. Everything appeared arranged toward endurance. She felt no fear. Fear required uncertainty. This journey offered none. Its tone was controlled, deliberate, resolved. She sensed that she was being observed as closely as she was observing. This reciprocity mattered. It suggested seriousness. In the spaces between destinations, she reflected on why such a journey unsettled those who learned of it secondhand. It bypassed familiar channels. It refused to explain itself. It suggested that influence could move without permission. This disturbed the custodians of order more than any formal alliance might have. She noticed how questions followed her in absence. What did it mean? What would come of it? Why her? She did not answer these questions because answering them would have stabilized interpretation too early. Ambiguity preserved leverage. When she arrived, the reception was restrained. No welcome speeches, no symbolic gestures. She was acknowledged with practicality, not reverence. This suited her. Reverence implied expectation. Practicality implied parity. She sensed that the journey itself was the test, not what she said, but how she arrived, not what she requested, but what she did not. They were assessing whether she carried the habits of spectacle with her, or whether she understood restraint as fluency. She passed without effort. She also recognized that the journey's significance lay not in destination, but in precedent. It demonstrated that access was possible without alignment, that dialogue could occur without concession, that power could be acknowledged without endorsement. This alone altered calculations elsewhere. Back home, the absence of clarity created unease. Markets did not react overtly, but conversations shifted. People spoke more carefully. Assumptions were revisited. The journey lingered as an unanswered question, and unanswered questions were destabilizing. She did not rush to resolve it. She understood that some events mattered not for what they produced, but for what they disrupted. This journey disrupted expectation. It suggested that old boundaries were porous, that influence could traverse them quietly, without ideological declaration. She never claimed the journey as achievement. She did not frame it as milestone. She allowed it to remain what it was, movement without explanation. In time, others would attempt to interpret it, to assign motive, to retroactively impose meaning. They would miss the essential truth. The journey should not have mattered because it changed nothing immediately. And yet, precisely because it did not announce itself, it altered how power understood movement. Sometimes, she knew, the most consequential acts were the ones that appeared optional. And this journey, uncelebrated, unexplained, and deliberately modest, would linger in memory not as event, but as signal. That was enough. The interior revealed itself gradually, not as revelation, but as correction. Whatever images the outside world carried of the Soviet state, grand parades, rigid banners, clenched certainty, fell away once she crossed fully inside its working spaces. Here, power did not announce itself theatrically. It compressed. It narrowed corridors, simplified rooms, stripped surfaces of ornament until only function remained. Nothing was accidental. Buildings were practical to the point of austerity. Furniture was chosen for durability rather than comfort. Decoration existed only where it reinforced authority. Portraits placed precisely, symbols rendered without flourish. The environment communicated a single message with disciplined consistency. This system did not exist to please, it existed to endure. She felt this immediately. The air itself seemed regulated. Movement followed prescribed routes. Conversation adjusted to walls that listened. Even silence carried different weight here, not social, but structural. It was the silence of organization, not discretion. She understood then that she had entered not a country, but a mechanism. The Soviet interior did not invite interpretation, it discouraged it. Clarity replaced ambiguity. Purpose replaced nuance. Everything pointed toward order, enforced and unquestioned. For those accustomed to fluid influence, this rigidity could feel hostile. For her, it felt intelligible. She recognized the logic instantly. After chaos, systems either fragmented or hardened. This one had chosen hardening. Where uncertainty once flourished, procedure now ruled. Where spontaneity threatened coherence, regulation intervened. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was consolidation. She observed how carefully access was managed. Doors opened only when necessary. Information arrived in controlled increments. Hospitality was precise, neither warm nor cold. There was no attempt to charm her, no effort to intimidate her. Both tactics were unnecessary. The system relied on inevitability rather than persuasion. She noticed how differently power behaved here compared to the environments she knew. In her world, influence flowed through networks, softened by discretion. Here, influence moved vertically, reinforced by structure. Decisions did not ripple outward subtly. They descended. And yet, beneath this rigidity, she sensed something familiar. Fatigue. Not physical exhaustion, but administrative strain. The effort required to maintain total coherence was immense. Every deviation demanded correction. Every exception threatened precedent. The system functioned, but it did not breathe easily. She did not comment on this. Observation required silence. Those who accompanied her treated her with professional neutrality. They did not flatter. They did not test. They recorded. Their attention was steady, unblinking, evaluative. She recognized this gaze. It was the gaze of a system deciding whether something was tolerable. She adjusted accordingly. She did not linger. She did not ask unnecessary questions. She moved at the pace provided. Her composure registered, not as admiration, but as compatibility. This mattered. She understood that the Soviet interior did not fear wealth or influence. It feared unpredictability. Chaos had been its enemy. Anything that reintroduced volatility would be resisted. Her greatest asset in this environment was not her fortune or her connections. It was her restraint. She made no comparisons aloud. She offered no judgments. She treated the system as it treated her, with clarity, discipline, and minimal emotion. This mutual restraint created a narrow space of respect. As she moved deeper into its interior spaces, she sensed the purpose of her presence crystallizing. This was not a charm offensive. It was not diplomacy in the traditional sense. It was assessment. They were measuring whether influence could exist without destabilization, whether capital could be acknowledged, without corruption, whether someone shaped by a different order could enter this one without disturbing its balance. She did not seek to reassure them verbally. She allowed her behavior to answer. By the time she reached the inner rooms where conversation was permitted but never casual, she understood the stakes. Entry itself was the signal. Being allowed to proceed indicated provisional acceptance. The Soviet interior did not grant trust easily, but it recognized discipline when it saw it. And in that recognition, the first quiet alignment took place, not of ideology, not of alliance, but of mutual understanding. She had entered the machine, and the machine, for the moment, did not reject her. The dinners were stripped of indulgence so thoroughly that indulgence itself seemed suspect. There were no cascades of courses, no orchestration of abundance meant to impress or distract. Plates arrived with purpose, portions measured, flavors direct. Nothing lingered longer than necessary. Nothing invited comment. The meal existed to sustain, not to seduce. She understood the message immediately. Excess was considered a liability here. It suggested softness, distraction, vulnerability. Where she came from, abundance had been softened into elegance. Here, elegance had been removed entirely. What remained was function. The room reflected this philosophy. Tables were solid, surfaces clear. Seating was arranged for efficiency rather than hierarchy. There was no visible host asserting dominance through placement or ritual. Authority was present, but it did not perform itself. It assumed itself. Conversation followed the same discipline. Topics were limited. Language was precise. No one spoke merely to be heard. When someone did speak, it was because the words were required. Silence filled the space between statements without discomfort. It was not a pause awaiting entertainment. It was an interval of consideration. She adapted without effort. Her upbringing had prepared her for restraint, though of a different kind. Where her world concealed power behind elegance, this one concealed it behind austerity. The mechanisms differed, but the objective was identical: control through environment. She noticed how the absence of excess altered behavior. Without distraction, attention sharpened. People listened fully. There was no refuge in small talk, no opportunity to soften difficult truths with charm. Statements landed cleanly, unbuffered. This clarity appealed to her. She also observed what the meal excluded: no alcohol, no lingering desserts, no ceremonial toasts. These omissions were intentional. They prevented relaxation. They maintained alertness. They preserved hierarchy without dramatizing it. She understood that indulgence, even when controlled, introduced unpredictability. It loosened boundaries. It encouraged sentiment. This system tolerated none of that. It required vigilance. Those seated with her did not attempt to impress. They did not seek approval. They asked questions that were narrow and deliberate. They listened closely to her answers, not for content alone, but for cadence, for hesitation, for tone. She answered as she always did, carefully, without ornament. She did not offer anecdotes. She did not fill silence. She did not defend positions she had not claimed. This restraint registered immediately. The atmosphere adjusted subtly, as if recalibrated. She sensed that these dinners were not about hospitality. They were about exposure. They placed individuals in an environment stripped of comfort to observe how they functioned without it. Those who relied on charm faltered. Those who required affirmation grew restless. Those who thrived on discipline settled. She belonged to the last category. The lack of excess also neutralized social signaling. Without luxury to display, status was expressed through composure alone, how one sat, how one waited, how one responded when challenged. These signals were harder to counterfeit. She appreciated this economy. When the meal ended, it ended abruptly. Plates were cleared, chairs were pushed back. There was no suggestion to linger. Business did not follow immediately. That, too, was deliberate. It prevented emotional carryover. It forced separation between sustenance and decision. She left each dinner with a clearer understanding of the system she had entered. This was a world that had rejected pleasure as destabilizing and embraced control as virtue. It had learned, through catastrophe, to mistrust abundance. She did not mistake this for moral superiority. It was strategy. In her own world, excess had been managed through refinement. Here, it had been eliminated entirely. Both approaches sought the same end: predictability. As she reflected on these meals later, she understood their deeper purpose. They tested whether she would attempt to reintroduce softness, whether she would miss indulgence enough to betray discomfort. She did neither. Dinners without excess demanded self-sufficiency. And in meeting that demand quietly, she signaled something more valuable than admiration. She signaled compatibility. He did not announce himself. That, more than anything else, defined the moment. There was no theatrical entrance, no deliberate pause designed to command attention. He simply appeared, already present, already observing, as if he had been there long before anyone thought to look for him. She recognized the posture immediately. This was not the gaze of a man seeking approval, nor of one accustomed to persuasion. It was the gaze of someone measuring containment, assessing risk, calculating deviation. He watched not for what was offered, but for what escaped control unintentionally. She felt the weight of that attention without responding to it. The room adjusted subtly around him. Conversation narrowed, bodies aligned instinctively. No one leaned too far in any direction. Authority here did not require assertion. It existed as condition. Like pressure, it shaped behavior without announcing itself. She understood that she was not being evaluated for charm, nor for allegiance. He had no use for either. What interested him was discipline, whether she carried volatility with her, whether her presence introduced unpredictability into a system that survived by eliminating it. He spoke little. When he did, his words were economical, stripped of flourish, statements rather than questions, observations rather than opinions. He did not seek exchange. He sought confirmation. She replied in kind. Her answers were concise, deliberate, without apology or elaboration. She did not soften them. She did not dramatize them. She allowed silence to settle between sentences, letting meaning stand without reinforcement. This restraint was noticed. He watched her not as a woman, nor as a representative of wealth, nor even as a visitor from another order, but as an anomaly. Someone shaped by a system that prized continuity without rigidity, influence without command, power without spectacle. That combination intrigued him. He'd seen many visitors before, idealists, opportunists, sympathizers, adversaries. They arrived with certainty or fear, sometimes both. They spoke too much. They revealed allegiance through tone before content. They mistook engagement for safety. She did none of this. Her composure did not challenge him. It did not flatter him. It existed independently of him. This was rare. Most people adjusted their posture in response to his presence. She maintained hers. This did not go unnoticed. He asked questions that were deceptively simple, about systems, about endurance, about what survived when belief failed. These were not philosophical inquiries, they were operational. She answered without ideology. She spoke of structures rather than ideals, of fatigue rather than conviction, of stability as necessity rather than virtue. She did not defend capitalism. She did not condemn revolution. She treated both as mechanisms subject to stress and collapse. This neutrality was unsettling to those listening. He listened closely. She sensed that what interested him most was not agreement, but predictability. He governed a system that demanded obedience, but obedience alone was insufficient. It required comprehension. He wanted to know whether she understood why order mattered and whether she would threaten it inadvertently. He watched for signs of indulgence, of moral hesitation, of sentimental attachment to abstraction. He found none. What he observed instead was a discipline shaped differently, but disciplined nonetheless. The encounter did not conclude with resolution. That was never its purpose. There were no assurances exchanged, no commitments implied. When it ended simply, without punctuation. She left the room aware that she had not impressed him. She had done something more difficult. She had not disturbed him. Later, others would speculate about the meaning of that dinner, that meeting, that moment. They would search for declarations that never occurred. They would imagine bargains struck in shadow. They would misunderstand. What mattered was not what was said. It was that he watched carefully and found nothing he needed to correct. In his world, that was not indifference. It was provisional acceptance. And in systems built on control, provisional acceptance was the rarest currency of all. What unsettled them was not her presence, but the absence of explanation around it. In a system built on classification, ally or enemy, worker or official, loyal or suspect, she did not resolve cleanly into any category. She was not introduced with credentials that justified her access, nor accompanied by ideology that clarified her intent. She existed in the space between definitions, and that space was uncomfortable. They searched for labels instinctively. Diplomat, financier, sympathizer, curiosity. Each failed under scrutiny. She did not behave as any of these would have been expected to behave. She made no appeals. She expressed no admiration. She offered no critique. She did not ask for protection, nor signal threat. This absence of narrative disturbed the rhythm of the place. The Soviet interior was designed to explain everything. Portraits explained authority, slogans explained sacrifice, uniforms explained hierarchy. Even silence was accounted for, framed as discipline, rather than ambiguity. She alone resisted explanation simply by existing as she was. She did not demand space, she occupied it. Observers attempted to decode her through familiar frameworks. Wealth, they reasoned, must seek influence. Influence must seek leverage. Leverage must demand return. But her behavior contradicted this logic. She did not press. She did not negotiate. She did not attempt to shape outcomes directly. Instead, she listened. Listening without intention was rare here. Information was gathered to be used. Silence preceded instruction. Attention was always preparatory. Her listening felt different. It was not acquisitive. It did not anticipate command. It registered. This made her difficult to place. Some assumed this opacity was deliberate deception. Others suspected arrogance. A few recognized something else entirely, discipline of a different origin. Not secrecy imposed by fear, but restraint learned through longevity. She understood their discomfort and did nothing to alleviate it. Explanation would have simplified her. Simplification would have reduced her utility. By remaining undefined, she preserved freedom of movement. She noticed how conversations shifted in her presence. Statements were phrased more cautiously. Assertions softened. Certainty hesitated. Not because she challenged them, but because she did not respond in expected ways. Without reaction, speakers were forced to confront their own words. This dynamic unsettled even seasoned officials. In private, some speculated that she represented something larger, an unseen network, an unspoken consensus. They were not entirely wrong, but the truth was subtler. She did not represent a group so much as a method, a way of operating that did not rely on declaration or enforcement. She was not explained because she did not need to be. Her world did not require explanation to function, it relied on recognition. Those who belonged sensed alignment without being told. Those who did not felt it just as clearly. Explanation was for those who expected justification. She carried this posture effortlessly. She had been trained not to resolve into spectacle, not to clarify herself for the comfort of others. In her upbringing, explanation had been a form of concession. Authority did not explain itself. It waited to be understood. Here, that posture translated unexpectedly well. Those accustomed to suspicion found nothing concrete to oppose. Those inclined toward hostility found no target. Those seeking alliance found no invitation. She remained simply present. This presence functioned as a test. It revealed how much the system depended on categorization, how much discomfort arose when categories failed, how quickly authority reached for explanation when uncertainty appeared. She did not exploit this weakness. She did not need to. Her value lay precisely in being a woman not explained, one who did not require narrative to justify her access, whose influence did not announce itself, whose legitimacy did not depend on ideology. In a world that demanded clarity at all costs, she embodied ambiguity without chaos, and that, more than anything she might have said or done, ensured she would be remembered, not for what she represented, but for what she refused to become. She remained undefined, and in systems built on control, the undefined was never ignored for long. The contest did not announce itself as such. There were no raised voices, no pointed challenges, no obvious clash of positions. On the surface, the exchanges appeared civil, measured statements, polite acknowledgments, brief pauses. To an untrained observer, it might have looked like conversation. To those who understood power, it was something else entirely. Conversation here was a form of pressure testing. Each sentence carried weight not because of what it declared, but because of what it risked. Words were placed carefully, like pieces moved across a board where mistakes could not be reversed. The objective was not persuasion, it was exposure, to see who revealed too much, to see who flinched, to see who misunderstood the rules. She recognized this immediately. In her world, conversation had always been performative, social cues exchanged beneath pleasantries. Here, performance was stripped away, speech was functional. Every phrase invited evaluation, every pause invited interpretation. She treated it accordingly. When she spoke, she did so without ornament. No qualifiers meant to soften impact, no rhetoric meant to impress. Her sentences were brief, balanced, and deliberately incomplete. She left space for others to respond, knowing that response was the point. They tested her with assertions framed as fact, statements about inevitability, about history's direction, about the weakness of systems built on compromise. These were not invitations to agree. They were provocations, designed to see whether she would resist, concede, or attempt to reframe. She did none of these. Instead, she acknowledged structure rather than belief. She spoke of endurance rather than destiny, of fatigue rather than failure. This unsettled them. Ideology demanded affirmation or rejection. Her answers offered neither. The contest intensified quietly. Questions narrowed, language sharpened, references grew more specific. They were probing for allegiance, for discomfort, for ideological reflex. She responded with patience, refusing to be drawn into binaries that simplified the exchange. She understood that the moment she defended her own system, she would become predictable. The moment she criticized theirs, she would become adversarial. Predictability invited containment, adversarial posture invited correction. She offered instead comparison without hierarchy. Systems, she observed, behaved differently under pressure. Some fractured, some hardened, some adapted. None were immune. This was not critique, it was observation. It shifted the contest subtly, from belief to mechanics. Those listening adjusted. They began to engage with her on operational terms. What sustained order? What exhausted populations? What allowed authority to persist beyond fear? These questions mattered more to them than ideological purity. She answered carefully, aware that each response was being weighed for implication. She avoided prescriptions. She did not advise. She described patterns she had witnessed elsewhere, leaving conclusions unstated. This restraint frustrated some. Others recognized its discipline. Conversation continued, but the dynamic had shifted. They were no longer testing whether she could be converted or opposed. They were testing whether she could be integrated without disruption. She passed this test by refusing to win it. In her upbringing, she had learned that contests were rarely won by those who sought victory openly. Victory invited retaliation. Stability required equilibrium. She treated conversation the same way she treated influence, not as a means of domination, but as a method of alignment. She also understood when to withdraw. When exchanges approached redundancy, when repetition signaled diminishing returns, she allowed silence to settle. Silence, here, functioned differently than in her world. It was not social, it was evaluative. By remaining silent at the correct moment, she avoided overextension. They noticed this. The contest concluded without resolution, as all effective contests of this kind did. No declarations were made, no positions formalized. But something had shifted. The room understood her limits more clearly and respected them. She had not conceded ground. She had not claimed it either. Later, others would attempt to reconstruct the exchange, to identify the moment where leverage changed hands. They would fail. The change had not occurred in a single sentence or gesture. It had emerged gradually, through discipline. Conversation, she knew, was never neutral. It was a contest of restraint, of timing, of what one chose not to say. And by treating it as such, without appearing to compete at all, she ensured that when the contest ended, she remained standing precisely where she had begun. Unmoved, unclaimed, and therefore, uncontained. The most consequential moments passed without language. There were no declarations marking their arrival, no phrases later underlined or quoted, nothing that could be transcribed, cited, or denied. What mattered existed in the gaps, between sentences, between glances, between decisions deferred rather than made. She understood this instinctively. In rooms where power was accustomed to command, speech was often treated as instrument, orders were given, positions stated, certainty asserted. Here, however, speech had limits. Too much of it hardened positions prematurely. Too little of it invited suspicion. The balance lay elsewhere. She paid attention not to what was said, but to what was deliberately avoided. Certain subjects surfaced only indirectly. Names appeared briefly, then vanished. Events were referenced obliquely, stripped of moral framing. Questions were posed without expectation of answer. These absences were not oversights. They were boundaries. She respected them, not because she feared crossing them, but because crossing them would have clarified too much. Clarity in this environment was dangerous. It forced alignment where ambiguity preserved maneuverability. She noticed how often others spoke around points rather than through them, how statements circled conclusions without landing, how acknowledgement replaced agreement. This was not evasion, it was preservation. What was not said maintained deniability. In her own world, she had learned this lesson early. Decisions made aloud could be contested. Decisions implied through silence were harder to challenge. Silence did not commit, it suggested. Here, that logic was magnified. No one explicitly discussed limits, but limits were understood. No one announced expectations, but expectations governed behavior. No one demanded loyalty, but deviation carried consequence. These things did not need articulation. Articulation weakened them. She observed how carefully everyone avoided certain verbs: promise, guarantee, commit. Language remained provisional, conditional. Statements were framed as observations rather than intentions. This allowed retreat without humiliation and advance without announcement. She mirrored this discipline precisely. When asked for impressions, she offered none that could be weaponized. When invited to speculate, she declined gently. When silence stretched, she allowed it to remain unfilled. Her restraint did not read as resistance, it read as comprehension. This mattered more than agreement ever could. Those evaluating her were not seeking affirmation of their system. They were seeking confirmation that she would not destabilize it through excess clarity, that she understood when not to speak, that she recognized the value of leaving things unresolved. She sensed gradually that the meeting's purpose was not to reach understanding, but to avoid misunderstanding, to ensure that no false assumptions would force premature action. In this sense, success lay in incompleteness. The absence of conclusion was the conclusion. Later, when others attempted to interpret the encounter, they would search for statements that did not exist. They would ask what had been agreed upon, what concessions made, what lines crossed. They would find nothing. This absence would frustrate them. She understood that frustration was intentional. It preserved flexibility. It prevented escalation. It ensured that no party could claim authority over the narrative. The story remained unclaimed and therefore uncontrollable. What was not said also protected her. Had she articulated her views fully, she would have fixed herself in place. She would have become legible in ways that invited response. By withholding, she remained adaptable. She could not be quoted, contradicted, or accused. Silence, here, was not emptiness. It was insulation. She left the encounter aware that its true substance would never be documented. It would exist only in altered behavior, in subtle shifts of tone, in recalibrated expectations, in doors that opened later without explanation. Those changes would be attributed to circumstance, to inevitability, to forces no one could quite name. She accepted this anonymity gladly. In her experience, history rarely recorded what mattered most. It preserved speeches, not pauses, declarations, not hesitations. Yet outcomes were shaped in the quiet spaces where nothing appeared to happen. What was not said lingered longer than any sentence. And in that lingering, unspoken, unclaimed, and unresolved, the encounter achieved its purpose. Not by defining the future, but by refusing to close it. There was no moment that marked the end. No handshakes arranged for posterity, no statements prepared for translation, no summary offered to close the exchange neatly. The absence of conclusion was deliberate, and she recognized it as such. In systems governed by caution, endings were liabilities. Continuation was safer. She left without agreement because agreement would have demanded alignment, and alignment would have implied obligation. The corridors she retraced felt unchanged, yet subtly recalibrated. The same austerity, the same discipline, the same quiet vigilance, but now informed by familiarity. She was no longer an unknown quantity. She had been measured, tested, and permitted passage without resistance. That alone constituted an outcome, even if no one named it. Those who accompanied her did not offer debriefings. Questions were minimal, instructions unchanged. This restraint confirmed what she already understood. Nothing had failed. Nothing needed correction. Silence signaled satisfaction more reliably than praise ever could. She understood the logic of departure without resolution. An agreement fixed responsibility. It created expectations. It limited future movement. Leaving matters unresolved preserved optionality on all sides. It allowed each party to interpret the encounter according to its own needs without contradiction. This suited her perfectly. She had never believed that influence required formalization. Formalization invited scrutiny. Scrutiny invited constraint. Her world had always favored arrangements that functioned without documentation. Outcomes mattered more than authorship. As she prepared to depart, she sensed the careful neutrality with which her presence was being recorded. Not celebrated, not concealed, simply noted. A variable acknowledged and then released back into the system. This was the highest form of acceptance such a place offered. She carried no assurances with her, no promises to honor, no commitments to explain. This absence was protection. It allowed her to return home unchanged, unburdened by declarations she would later have to interpret or defend. She also understood that leaving without agreement shifted the burden of interpretation elsewhere. Those who remained would speculate privately. They would infer intention where none had been stated. They would adjust behavior cautiously, accounting for possibilities rather than certainties. This diffusion of meaning prevented reactionary decisions. It slowed response. It introduced hesitation where certainty might otherwise have hardened. Hesitation, she knew, was often stabilizing. As she crossed back through familiar borders, the world she re-entered reacted not to facts, but to rumors of ambiguity. Markets remained outwardly steady. Conversations grew more guarded, questions multiplied quietly. The lack of clarity unsettled more effectively than any announcement could have. She did not correct misconceptions. Correction would have closed interpretive space too early. She allowed ambiguity to do its work. Leaving without agreement also preserved her independence. She owed nothing. She had conceded nothing. She had not endorsed, condemned, or aligned. She had observed, listened, and departed intact. This mattered deeply. Many before her had arrived convinced they could extract something concrete: assurances, alliances, leverage. They left either compromised or disappointed. She left precisely as she had arrived, undefined. This undefined state protected her from being claimed by any narrative. No one could cite her as supporter or adversary. No one could accuse her of betrayal or allegiance. She existed outside the binaries that demanded explanation. In her own world, this restraint elevated her standing rather than diminished it. Those who understood power recognized the significance immediately. Those who did not were left to speculate. She did not frame the journey as success or failure. Such framing belonged to those who required validation. For her, success lay in preservation, in returning with position intact and options unclosed. Agreements ended conversations. Departures without agreement extended them indefinitely. As she settled back into familiar rooms, she noticed how often her absence had rearranged them. Chairs shifted, topics changed, names surfaced with new caution, doors opened slightly later than before. The system had absorbed her movement and adjusted. She had left without agreement, but she had not left without effect. And in the quiet recalibration that followed, unattributed, undocumented, and unclaimed, she recognized the mark of influence perfected. Nothing had been signed, yet nothing was the same. The effects did not arrive as consequence. They arrived as adjustment. No announcement followed her return. No editorials demanded explanation. No official channels acknowledged the journey's significance. Outwardly, the world continued as before. Markets opened, governments spoke, institutions performed their rituals. Yet beneath this surface, something had shifted, quietly and unmistakably. She noticed it first in tone. Conversations grew more cautious without becoming anxious. Assertions softened into contingencies. Plans that had once been spoken of with confidence acquired conditions, timelines, escape clauses. The language of inevitability receded, replaced by the language of prudence. No one attributed this change to her. That would have been improper. But the change was there all the same. Shockwaves, she knew, rarely announced themselves at their origin. They revealed themselves at a distance, where structures trembled slightly without collapsing. The strongest systems were those that absorbed disturbance invisibly, redistributing strain until equilibrium returned. Her world excelled at this. In boardrooms and drawing rooms alike, she sensed recalibration. Capital hesitated where it once surged. Alliances were reviewed discreetly. Introductions delayed. The absence of clarity introduced friction, and friction slowed momentum. This slowing was not paralysis, it was reassessment. Those who had believed power moved in straight lines were unsettled. Those accustomed to cycles recognized the pattern immediately. A variable had entered the equation, undefined, unclaimed, unresolved. It required accommodation. No one admitted this openly. Admission would have granted the shockwave a source. Instead, it was attributed to atmosphere, to global uncertainty, to the inevitable complexity of modern affairs. Explanations proliferated. None named her. She observed how this anonymity amplified effect. Without a visible cause, responses became cautious rather than confrontational. No one could oppose a rumor without confirming its relevance. No one could dismiss a possibility without appearing reckless. This uncertainty suited her. She did not intervene. Intervention would have stabilized interpretation too quickly. She allowed the shockwaves to disperse naturally, trusting the system to find its new balance. Systems always did, given time. She also noticed who reacted most strongly. Those whose power depended on speed bristled at delay. Those whose authority relied on certainty grew defensive. Their discomfort exposed fragility. Others, older institutions, quieter actors, adjusted smoothly. They had survived disruption before. She made note of this. The most telling changes occurred in what was not pursued. Certain ventures stalled, certain conversations never resumed, certain alignments quietly dissolved. No explanation was offered, none was required. In her world, abandonment was the clearest form of judgment. She did not take credit for any of this. Credit invited accountability. Accountability narrowed freedom. She preferred influence without attribution. Privately, some speculated. They spoke of signals sent and received, of messages conveyed without words. They wondered whether boundaries had shifted, whether assumptions required revision. Their speculation mattered less than their behavior. Behavior changed. She understood that shockwaves were most effective when they were deniable, when those affected could tell themselves the cause lay elsewhere. This preserved dignity and prevented retaliation. The system corrected itself without conflict. Time passed. The immediate tremors faded, yet the landscape did not return entirely to its former shape. Certain pathways remained altered, certain shortcuts closed permanently. New routes emerged quietly, accommodating the revised terrain. She adapted effortlessly. Her position, if anything, strengthened. She had demonstrated the rare ability to move through volatile space, without igniting it. This skill was noticed by those who mattered most. They did not praise it. They incorporated it into their calculations. The shockwaves no one admitted did their work precisely because they were never acknowledged. They reshaped expectation without demanding response. They introduced caution without provoking fear. She understood then that influence reached its most refined form when it left no trace of intention. History would not record the journey's consequences clearly. It would note changes without assigning cause. Analysts would debate trends without identifying catalysts. The record would remain inconclusive. She accepted this gladly. In her experience, the most durable outcomes were those no one could quite explain. They resisted reversal because they were never formally established. They endured because they had been absorbed rather than imposed. The shockwaves settled. And in their settling, the world adjusted itself just enough to account for her passage without ever admitting that anything had happened at all. The rooms welcomed her back without comment. Nothing in their arrangement had changed. Chairs stood where they always had. Conversations resumed with practiced ease. Faces reflected recognition rather than curiosity. If anything had shifted, it had done so internally, an adjustment of weight rather than shape. The familiarity itself was reassuring, and she understood why the system valued it so deeply. Continuity was comfort, yet she sensed immediately that familiarity did not mean stasis. The rooms felt more alert, as though quietly attuned to possibility. People listened more carefully, pauses lingered a fraction longer. Decisions were approached with additional layers of consideration. No one referenced her journey directly, but its absence from discussion was itself a signal. She moved through these spaces with the same composure she had always maintained. There was no return performance to give, no narrative to correct. She allowed others to read into her presence what they wished. In doing so, she preserved the ambiguity that had already begun to reshape behavior. Familiar rooms, she knew, were where influence either dissipated or matured. Novelty carried power only briefly. Endurance was tested at home. She noticed how conversations subtly reoriented themselves around her, as they always had, but now with a slightly altered calibration. Topics shifted toward caution rather than confidence. Projections included contingency. Optimism arrived tempered with realism. These adjustments were small, but cumulative. She did not steer them. Steering would have revealed intent. Instead, she listened. She observed which anxieties surfaced unprompted, which ambitions softened, which alliances appeared suddenly fragile. The familiar rooms long practiced in discretion revealed more than unfamiliar ones ever could. They exposed how systems reacted when confronted with uncertainty that could not be named. Some sought reassurance. They spoke indirectly of stability, of resilience, of enduring principles. She responded with acknowledgement, not affirmation. Others avoided her entirely, mistaking silence for judgment. She allowed this misunderstanding to stand. Distance, when self-imposed, clarified relationships efficiently. She also noticed how quickly attention shifted away from spectacle. The dramatic lost its appeal. Conversations returned to fundamentals: supply, timing, endurance. The familiar rooms had absorbed the lesson without acknowledging its source. This pleased her. Returning to these spaces reaffirmed a truth she had long understood: influence endured only when it could be reintegrated seamlessly. Any effect that disrupted routine too visibly risked rejection. Her presence did the opposite. It restored equilibrium by expanding perspective quietly. She resumed her role without modification, no new authority claimed, no old habits discarded. Yet the context in which those habits operated had changed. Familiar gestures now carried additional meaning. Familiar silences deepened. She understood that the real test of her journey was not what occurred abroad, but how her world adjusted to her return. Here, among those most practiced in power's subtleties, influence was refined rather than announced. They did not ask what she had seen. They did not ask what had been said. They did not ask what would happen next. Their restraint signaled comprehension. They knew better than to demand clarity where ambiguity preserved advantage. In these rooms, history moved slowly. Change arrived disguised as continuity. She was part of that process, both catalyst and stabilizer, without ever needing to claim either role. As she settled back into familiar chairs, she felt no sense of completion. Completion belonged to narratives. Her work, if it could be called that, operated outside such framing. It unfolded incrementally, absorbed into habit, embedded into expectation. Returning to familiar rooms did not diminish what had occurred. It confirmed it. Because influence that survived return, unchallenged, unremarked, and intact, was influence that had truly taken hold. Money rarely moved abruptly in her world. When it did, something had gone wrong. The more common motion was subtler, an easing of pressure here, a tightening there, capital redirected without announcement, risk redistributed without explanation. From the outside, nothing appeared to change. From within, balances shifted decisively. She observed this process with the same restraint she brought to everything else. No orders were issued, no meetings convened for the purpose of redirection alone. Instead, preferences adjusted. Timelines lengthened. Certain ventures received less enthusiasm, others more patience. Money followed these cues obediently, as it always had. Repositioning did not imply retreat. It implied preparation. She understood that capital, like power, survived by anticipating strain rather than reacting to collapse. The world had grown less predictable, not dramatically, but measurably. Assumptions once treated as stable now required verification. Certainty had become expensive. Money adapted. Investments were diversified further, not for profit alone, but for insulation. Exposure to volatility was reduced quietly. Commitments were structured with greater flexibility. The language of permanence softened into the language of endurance. She did not direct this process explicitly. That would have been unnecessary and inelegant. Those responsible for stewarding wealth understood her signals. They had been trained, like her, to recognize when the environment demanded recalibration. The most telling changes occurred in what was no longer pursued aggressively. Certain markets lost their urgency. Certain expansions were postponed indefinitely. Certain partnerships cooled without confrontation. No blame was assigned. Blame implied error. This was adjustment, not correction. She noticed how quickly money responded to ambiguity. Where clarity was absent, capital preferred distance. Where certainty wavered, it demanded safeguards. This was not fear. It was discipline. She also understood the optics of repositioning. Sudden movement attracted attention. Gradual drift did not. The latter preserved stability while achieving the same ends. Her world had perfected this art long ago. Publicly, confidence remained intact. Statements continued. Forecasts were offered. Optimism persisted in measured tones. Privately, the calculus had changed. Risk was being priced differently. The margin for error had narrowed. She allowed this to happen without commentary. Money repositioned itself around her presence rather than at her instruction. This distinction mattered. It preserved the fiction of independence that made the system functional. Each actor believed they were responding to conditions, not influence. In practice, both were true. She also recognized what did not change. Core holdings remained untouched, long-term positions held steady. Enduring institutions continued to receive support. The system did not abandon its foundations, it reinforced them. Repositioning was selective, not panicked. She understood that wealth which survived upheaval did so by knowing what to move and what to anchor. Too much movement signaled anxiety, too little invited exposure. The balance lay in knowing which assets were flexible and which were structural. This knowledge was rarely articulated, it was felt. As money shifted, behavior followed. Ambition softened into caution, innovation slowed into consolidation, speculation yielded to stewardship. None of this was announced as reaction to external events. It was framed as maturity. She recognized the pattern. She had seen it before, after wars, after crashes, after ideological shifts. Money learned lessons faster than institutions ever did. What distinguished this moment was the absence of crisis. There had been no collapse, no panic, no visible trigger. The repositioning occurred preemptively, informed by possibility rather than damage. This was its strength. Those outside her world might have missed it entirely. Charts would not reveal it clearly. Headlines would not capture it. But within the system, the adjustment was unmistakable. Money had changed posture. She did not congratulate herself for this. Pride implied ownership. Ownership implied accountability. She preferred to remain adjacent, to observe rather than claim. Money repositioned because it always did when conditions shifted subtly enough to be felt but not named. It responded to signals that never became statements. And in that response, quiet, disciplined, and deniable, the system demonstrated its true resilience. Nothing dramatic occurred, which was precisely the point. The dinner itself had passed without incident. No one had raised their voice. No glass had shattered. No phrase lingered long enough to be repeated later with certainty. It had been, by all outward measures, unremarkable, and yet its shadow stretched far beyond the table, lengthening quietly over decisions that would be made weeks, months, even years later. She understood this phenomenon well. Some gatherings existed only for the evening, others persisted. The difference lay not in what was discussed, but in what was recalibrated. That dinner had altered posture, it had shifted confidence, it had introduced a hesitation that did not resolve into doubt, but into caution. The shadow did not announce itself immediately. It emerged gradually, felt rather than named. Invitations were reconsidered, conversations delayed, proposals revised before being submitted. People who had left the table believing nothing had happened found themselves behaving differently without knowing why. She watched this unfold with practiced detachment. Those who had spoken most forcefully that evening softened first. Their certainty, once rehearsed, now required qualification. They spoke of conditions, of variables, of timing. The shadow had not contradicted them, it had slowed them. And slowing, she knew, was often enough to change outcomes. Others reacted by retreating. They withdrew from discussions they had once dominated. They declined opportunities they might previously have seized. The shadow exposed limits they had not recognized before. In doing so, it clarified hierarchy without confrontation. She noticed how rarely anyone referenced the dinner directly. Mentioning it would have required acknowledging its significance, and significance invited scrutiny. Instead, its influence diffused into atmosphere. It became part of the unspoken context against which decisions were now weighed. This diffusion was essential. A single event could be dismissed, a shift in atmosphere could not. It persisted even when memory faded. People forgot details but retained impressions. They could not explain why caution felt necessary, only that it did. She had learned long ago that power preferred this form of persistence, outcomes shaped by memory rather than record-resisted challenge. There was nothing to argue against, nothing to disprove, only a sense that certain paths no longer felt viable. The dinner's shadow also revealed who understood influence and who merely performed it. Those fluent in power adapted quietly. They adjusted strategies without complaint. They recognized the new boundaries and moved within them. Those less adept grew frustrated, sensing obstruction without identifying source. They blamed personalities, timing, coincidence. They did not recognize shadow as structure. She did not intervene to clarify. Intervention would have collapsed the shadow into event. It would have assigned authorship. Shadows required anonymity to function. They existed only so long, as no one claimed them. She also understood that the shadow would not last forever. Nothing did. Over time, new events would layer over it, new impressions would dilute it, but by then, the dinner's work would already have been done. Decisions altered during its longest reach would endure. The shadow had also protected her. It allowed her influence to extend without visible exertion. She did not need to repeat herself. She did not need to attend every gathering. The memory of her presence sufficed. This economy of action preserved her position and minimized exposure. In her experience, the most effective power always cast a long shadow while remaining unseen itself. Visibility shortened reach. Anonymity extended it. As she reflected on that evening later, she did not recall specific sentences. She recalled posture, pacing, restraint. She recalled who listened, who resisted, who adjusted too late. These details mattered far more than content. The long shadow of a dinner was not accidental. It was the result of careful balance, enough tension to provoke reflection, enough restraint to avoid rupture. It required understanding of when to speak and when to allow silence to do the work. That dinner had achieved precisely this balance. Nothing decisive had occurred, and because of that, everything that followed would bear its imprint, subtle, unacknowledged, and impossible to trace cleanly. The shadow would fade eventually, but not before it had quietly rearranged the future. Ownership was a temptation she had learned to resist early. To own influence was to expose it, to invite scrutiny, challenge, and eventual dilution. Influence that announced itself demanded defense. Influence that claimed credit invited contest. The most enduring power, she knew, operated without signature. What followed the dinner, the journey, the quiet recalibrations, was not a consolidation of authority, but a dispersal of it. Effects appeared in places she did not visit, decisions she did not attend, conversations she never heard. This diffusion was not accidental. It was the natural consequence of influence exercised without possession. She did not instruct. She did not direct. She allowed alignment to occur organically, trusting those who recognized the shift to act accordingly. This trust was not sentimental. It was strategic. Those capable of interpreting subtle change required no guidance. Those who were not would have misused it anyway. She observed how quickly people attempted to assign ownership where none existed. Some credited institutions, others blamed circumstance. A few suspected conspiracy. None of these explanations mattered. Ownership remained unresolved, and therefore influence remained mobile. It could not be seized, confronted, or dismantled. This was its strength. In her world, possession implied responsibility. Responsibility demanded justification. Justification constrained action. By refusing ownership, she preserved freedom, not only her own, but the system's. Each actor believed they were responding independently to conditions, unaware that their responses were harmonizing. This harmonization did not produce uniformity. It produced coherence. Decisions began to align without coordination. Caution echoed across sectors. Patience replaced haste. Long-term considerations displaced short-term advantage. No central authority enforced this shift. It emerged from shared recognition. She recognized the pattern with quiet satisfaction. Influence without ownership required discipline. It demanded restraint in moments where recognition beckoned. It required resisting the urge to explain, to clarify, to stabilize narrative. Stability would have fixed influence in place, making it vulnerable. She allowed misunderstanding to persist. Some mistook her silence for withdrawal. Others interpreted it as indifference. A few assumed she had overreached and retreated. None of these interpretations threatened her position. In fact, they protected it. Misinterpretation dispersed attention. She also understood the personal cost of this posture. Influence without ownership denied gratification. There were no acknowledgments, no affirmations, no visible markers of success. Satisfaction had to be internal, measured by outcomes rather than applause. This was not a burden for her. She had never relied on affirmation. Her training had prepared her for invisibility. As time passed, the system settled into its adjusted state. The initial uncertainty resolved into new norms. What had once felt cautious now felt prudent. What had once seemed restrained now appeared wise. The influence that had prompted these changes faded into background assumption. This was the ideal outcome. Influence that became assumption no longer required maintenance. It sustained itself. Those who entered the system later accepted its parameters as given, unaware that they had once been otherwise. History rarely recorded the moment when such shifts occurred. It recorded only the state that followed. She did not correct the record. Ownership would have invited questions history could not answer cleanly. By remaining unclaimed, influence slipped past documentation and into practice. It shaped behavior without leaving evidence. She reflected occasionally on how easily this could be misunderstood as passivity. Those unfamiliar with power's subtler forms often equated action with visibility. They mistook silence for absence. She knew better. Absence could be active. By refusing ownership, she allowed others to feel autonomous. Autonomy bred commitment. Commitment reinforced stability. The system strengthened itself, believing it acted independently. This belief was essential. She continued to occupy familiar rooms, to attend gatherings, to speak sparingly. Her presence neither expanded nor diminished. It simply endured. Those attuned to nuance recognized her role without needing it named. Those who did not were irrelevant. Influence without ownership was not humility. It was mastery. And in choosing it repeatedly, quietly, consistently, she ensured that what she had set in motion would outlast her presence, her reputation, even her memory. Nothing bore her name. Yet everything moved as if it had learned from her example. Borders, she had learned, were rarely physical. They existed instead in habits, assumptions, and expectations, lines drawn by tradition rather than law, enforced by belief rather than guards. Crossing them required no passport. It required patience. What followed the repositioning of money and the diffusion of influence was not expansion, but reach. Not the visible extension of control, but the quiet alignment of distant decisions. Across borders she never crossed again, choices began to echo patterns she recognized. She noticed it first in timing. Decisions made abroad slowed to match the tempo that had emerged at home. Urgency gave way to sequencing. Risk was no longer embraced theatrically. It was measured, compartmentalized, absorbed gradually. These shifts occurred independently, or so it appeared. No correspondence connected them, no directive unified them, and yet they harmonized. This was the quiet reach she understood best, the kind that traveled without carrier, embedded in shared caution rather than instruction. Those who sensed change adjusted instinctively. Those who did not found themselves increasingly out of step, their confidence mismatched to the moment. She did not encourage this alignment. Encouragement would have implied intent. Instead, she allowed recognition to do its work. Recognition crossed borders effortlessly. It did not require translation. In places where rhetoric had once dominated, language softened. Grand statements yielded to conditional phrasing. Promises became projections. The certainty of direction dissolved into the prudence of navigation. This was not retreat. It was adaptation. She understood that systems learned from each other, not through imitation, but through observation. When one adjusted successfully, others took note. No one admitted this openly. Learning was framed as independent insight. The fiction of autonomy was preserved. This fiction mattered. Across borders, influence became indistinguishable from environment. It felt less like pressure and more like weather, an atmosphere one adapted to rather than resisted. People carried umbrellas without naming the storm. She recognized how easily this could be misread as coincidence. Analysts would attribute convergence to global trends, to shared challenges, to inevitability. They would not trace it back to moments that had never been documented. They would not suspect dinners without excess, conversations without conclusions, departures without agreement. They would see effect without cause. She preferred it that way. The quiet reach also revealed which borders were porous and which were performative. Some divisions dissolved quickly under shared caution. Others remained rigid, clinging to certainty long after it had become costly. These distinctions clarified where endurance lay. She took note without comment. Her role in this process remained invisible by design. She did not appear at conferences. She did not publish opinions. She did not grant interviews. Visibility would have localized influence, reducing its range. Silence allowed it to travel freely. She understood that influence which crossed borders without attribution could not be sanctioned. There was nothing to confront, nothing to negotiate, nothing to oppose. It existed as adjustment rather than intervention. This made it resilient. As months passed, the quiet reach settled into habit. New norms emerged that no one remembered choosing. Caution felt natural. Restraint felt responsible. Long-term thinking regained prestige. Those who resisted these shifts found themselves isolated, not by decree, but by mismatch. She did not celebrate this outcome. Celebration implied ownership, and ownership invited contest. She remained attentive instead, watching for imbalance, for excess caution hardening into stagnation. Influence required maintenance not through assertion, but through vigilance. Borders continued to exist. They always would. But the space between them, the realm of assumption and expectation, had changed subtly. It now favored endurance over acceleration, coherence over spectacle. She had not crossed those borders again. She did not need to. The quiet reach moved without her, carrying forward a posture she had helped normalize without ever claiming it. It threaded through decisions and delays alike, shaping outcomes by shaping what felt reasonable. This was influence at its furthest extension, not visible, not acknowledged. Simply present, everywhere it needed to be and nowhere it could be named. There came a moment, not marked by date or declaration, when permission quietly ceased to matter. No rule announced its disappearance. No authority rescinded it formally. It simply became irrelevant, a concept that no longer governed movement or decision. Power, having learned it could operate without explanation, stopped seeking approval altogether. She recognized this shift not as rupture, but as maturation. In earlier stages, influence had still gestured toward legitimacy. It had waited for acknowledgement, for tacit consent, for signals that its presence was tolerated. Now, those gestures faded. Action no longer paused to be sanctioned. Decisions proceeded on the assumption of inevitability rather than acceptance. This was not arrogance, it was efficiency. Permission, she had long understood, was a transitional requirement. It mattered when systems were uncertain of their own coherence. Once coherence stabilized, permission became redundant. Power that asked permission betrayed doubt. Power that no longer did had resolved it. She observed how this manifested in subtle ways. Projects advanced without preliminary consensus. Policies shifted without prolonged consultation. Financial currents adjusted before justification could be demanded. The sequence had reversed. Action first, explanation later, if at all. No one challenged this directly. Challenge required a clear line to contest, and the line had dissolved into process. Everything unfolded as adjustment, not decision. Responsibility diffused across structures too complex to confront individually. This diffusion protected the system. She did not interpret this moment as triumph. Triumph suggested conquest, and conquest required opposition. This was something quieter. The system had learned to trust its own calibration. It no longer needed external validation to proceed. She had contributed to this evolution not by commanding it, but by modeling restraint, by demonstrating that influence could move. Responsibly without announcement, she had normalized autonomy. Others followed instinctively, relieved to abandon the theater of justification. This relief mattered. Many had grown weary of performance, of declarations that satisfied no one, of permissions granted reluctantly and revoked unpredictably. Operating without asking simplified matters. It reduced friction. It conserved energy. She also recognized the risk inherent in this stage. Power unaccustomed to asking permission could drift toward insulation. Without feedback, it could misjudge environment. Without challenge, it could harden. The absence of permission removed one form of accountability, but it did not remove consequence. She remained attentive. Her role, as always, was not to intervene, but to observe whether balance endured. She watched for signs of overreach, for movements that accelerated too quickly, for decisions that mistook silence for consent universally. Thus far, restraint held. Those exercising power understood, perhaps intuitively, that freedom from permission did not absolve them from responsibility. It merely relocated it. Responsibility now lay in outcome rather than process. This suited her philosophy precisely. In her world, outcomes had always mattered more than formalities. Processes existed to protect outcomes, not to replace them. Once outcomes stabilized reliably, processes could relax. She noticed how those still seeking permission began to appear outdated. Their caution read as insecurity. Their insistence on approval slowed progress. They were not punished, they were bypassed. This bypassing was decisive. It signaled a new hierarchy, one based not on authority conferred, but on competence demonstrated. Those who acted effectively without oversight gained influence. Those who waited lost relevance. She understood that this was the culmination of a long arc, from uncertainty to consolidation, from consolidation to confidence, from confidence to autonomy. Power had completed its inward turn. It no longer looked outward for validation. She did not claim credit for this transition. Claiming credit would have reintroduced permission implicitly, permission to acknowledge, permission to attribute. She allowed the shift to remain unattributed, embedded in practice rather than narrative. As time passed, the question of permission faded from discourse entirely. It was no longer debated. It was no longer requested. It was no longer refused. It simply ceased to be part of the calculation. Power moved as weather moved, responding to conditions, not seeking consent from the landscape. She understood then that the most profound change was not in who held power, but in how it understood itself. It no longer defined legitimacy as something granted externally. It defined it as something maintained internally. This internal legitimacy was quieter, harder to challenge, and more durable. Power had stopped asking permission, and because it had learned restraint, before reaching this point, it did not need to announce that it had done so. It simply continued, steady, adaptive, and unconcerned with approval, moving forward as if no other way had ever existed. Legacy was not something she pursued. Those who sought it openly often mistook visibility for endurance, mistook recognition for permanence. She had seen too many monuments crumble beneath the weight of their own insistence. Ceremony preserved memory briefly. Systems preserved behavior far longer. What remained of her influence did not announce itself as inheritance. It did not arrive wrapped in narrative or attributed to intention. It existed instead as posture, embedded in how decisions were approached, how caution was valued, how silence was respected. This was the legacy she understood best. It appeared in habits rather than acknowledgments, in the way rooms settled into restraint without needing instruction, in the way ambition learned to slow itself without being curtailed, in the way certainty grew less theatrical and more conditional. No one named her in these moments. That absence was deliberate. Naming invited reinterpretation. Reinterpretation invited dilution. A legacy, unspoken, remained intact precisely because it resisted explanation. She observed how younger figures entered the system unaware that it had ever functioned differently. They inherited assumptions rather than stories. To them, patience felt natural. Ambiguity felt prudent. Influence without ownership felt obvious. They did not know these qualities had once required defense. This unawareness pleased her. It meant the adjustment had settled deeply enough to escape notice. What began as recalibration had become environment. What had once been deliberate had become instinct. Legacy in this form did not require maintenance. It sustained itself through practice. Those who operated within it reinforced it unconsciously, believing they acted independently. This belief was essential. It preserved autonomy while ensuring coherence. She also understood what her legacy was not. It was not loyalty. It was not allegiance. It was not doctrine. Those were brittle forms of inheritance, prone to fracture under stress. Her legacy did not instruct. It predisposed. It inclined systems toward restraint without demanding it, toward patience without enforcing it, toward endurance without glorifying it. These inclinations proved remarkably durable. She noticed, too, how easily this legacy could be misread as inevitability. Observers might conclude that the world had simply matured, that caution was the natural endpoint of complexity. They would not see the choices embedded quietly along the way. They would not suspect dinners without excess or departures without agreement. History, she knew, preferred inevitability to agency. It simplified narratives for comfort. She allowed it to do so. Legacy without ceremony also protected her from backlash. There was nothing to dismantle, nothing to reverse, nothing to discredit. Her influence could not be undone because it had never been formalized. It existed only as practice. This invisibility was its armor. As time passed, she receded, further from the center without disappearing entirely. Her presence became contextual rather than directive. She was consulted less, yet considered more. Her name surfaced rarely, but her posture echoed often. She did not mourn this transition. Visibility was never the goal. Stability was. In quiet moments, she reflected on how little of her effort would be recorded. There would be no chapter titles bearing her name, no doctrines attributed to her philosophy. Analysts would debate shifts without assigning cause. Credit would disperse among institutions and eras. She accepted this gladly. Legacy without ceremony spared her the burden of preservation. There would be no heirs required to defend her interpretation, no monuments to maintain, no rituals to repeat. What endured did so because it worked, not because it was remembered. She had learned long ago that the most profound legacies were those no one felt obligated to honor. They simply lived within them. And so her influence remained, quietly embedded, structurally sound, and entirely uncelebrated, guiding behavior without claiming authorship, shaping futures without demanding acknowledgement. Legacy, stripped of ceremony, proved to be the most resilient form of all. In the end, there was no ledger to balance, no final account tallied influence rendered or authority exercised. No document summarized her contributions, no archive preserved her intent. What remained of her work existed entirely outside the record, embedded not in ink but in habit. She had never trusted records. Records invited revision. They begged for interpretation. They required defense. Too often they transformed intent into artifact and artifact into burden. She had learned early that permanence lay not in documentation, but in repetition. What people did again and again until it no longer felt chosen. This was where she had always aimed. She moved through the last years of her public life without fanfare. Invitations arrived less frequently, but carried greater weight. Conversations shortened, yet deepened. Her presence was no longer required to initiate adjustment. It was enough that she existed within the system as proof of a certain posture. Restraint had become credible, because she embodied it without preaching. Those who encountered her late often misunderstood her quiet. They mistook it for withdrawal, for irrelevance, for age. They did not realize that silence, in a world accustomed to performance, carried authority of its own. She had outlived the need to explain. She observed, with some detachment, how narratives formed without her participation. Others were elevated, criticized, credited. Movements were named, eras defined. Her absence from these stories did not trouble her. She had never needed to appear central to be effective. History would move on, as it always did, reshaping memory to suit its appetite for clarity. It would simplify complexity, reduce nuance, assign causes where there had only been convergence. She would be omitted not because she lacked influence, but because her influence resisted narration. She found this appropriate. A woman who never needed the record did not fear omission. Omission preserved integrity. It prevented misinterpretation. It spared her from becoming symbol or warning or lesson. She remained what she had always been, a presence felt rather than explained. In quieter moments, she reflected on the paradox of endurance. The things that lasted longest were rarely those declared most loudly. They survived because they had been absorbed, not because they had been defended. They endured because they made sense in practice, not because they had been justified in theory. Her influence had followed this path precisely. She had not shaped the future by commanding it. She had shaped it by slowing it, by teaching it to pause, to consider, to refrain. In doing so, she had made room for endurance where spectacle once dominated. She did not consider this restraint virtuous. Virtue implied moral claim. This had been necessity. Systems that accelerated endlessly fractured. Those that learned to decelerate survived. If there was any lesson embedded in her life, it was this. But lessons belonged to historians, not to her. She had lived not to instruct, but to adjust. As her presence receded further into familiarity, she became less distinct, more atmospheric. People remembered her without recalling specifics. They recalled tone rather than statements, posture rather than decisions. This diffusion marked completion. Nothing remained to be done. She had never needed acknowledgement to proceed, and she did not require it to conclude. The system continued, altered in ways few could trace, steadied by habits no one remembered choosing. She had moved through power without claiming it, through history without naming herself within it. A woman who never needed the record did not disappear. She simply became indistinguishable from what endured.